Welcome to Night Mind Academy. Tonight, we're stepping into the darker corners of philosophy, the unsettling ideas that question everything we believe about meaning, identity, and existence. From determinism to the myth of Sisyphus, from terror management theory to the problem of other minds, these concepts don't offer comfort. They expose the cracks in how we understand life itself. If you're drawn to deep, thought-provoking ideas that keep you up at night, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new exploration. Now, let's face the uncomfortable truths. Will to live. The will to live is a psychological force that drives humans to continue existing, even when life becomes unbearable. This concept, explored deeply by philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, suggests that at our core, we possess an irrational, blind impulse to survive and perpetuate ourselves, regardless of whether life brings us happiness or suffering. What makes this concept disturbing is the realization that this will to live may not serve our best interests. Schopenhauer argued that life is essentially suffering, a constant cycle of desire and temporary satisfaction, followed by more desire. Yet, despite recognizing this pattern, we cannot simply choose to stop wanting to live. The will to live operates beneath our conscious reasoning, forcing us forward even when logic might suggest that non-existence would be preferable to endless suffering. This creates a philosophical trap. We are, in essence, prisoners of our own biological programming. Every achievement, every moment of pleasure, is merely a brief pause in an otherwise relentless march toward death, punctuated by pain, disappointment, and unfulfilled desires. The will to live compels us to reproduce, to strive, to hope, even though history and experience show us that satisfaction is always temporary and suffering is guaranteed. The truly unsettling aspect is that we cannot escape this force through rational thought alone. Knowing that life is suffering does not free us from the compulsion to continue living. We are like passengers on a ship with no captain, driven by winds we cannot control, toward a destination we did not choose. This biological imperative overrides our conscious wishes, making us complicit in our own continued existence, even when we question whether that existence has value or meaning. Hell is other people. Hell is other people. This famous phrase comes from French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit, and it captures a deeply disturbing truth about human existence and our relationships with others. The statement doesn't mean that other people are simply annoying or difficult to deal with. Instead, it points to something far more unsettling about the nature of consciousness, identity, and social existence. Sartre believed that we construct our sense of self partly through how others perceive us. When someone looks at us, judges us, or forms an opinion about who we are, they essentially trap us in their perception. We become objects in their consciousness, frozen in whatever role or identity they've assigned to us. The disturbing part is that we can never fully control or escape these external judgments. We are constantly being defined, categorized, and limited by the gaze of others. Even worse, we often need this external validation to feel real and meaningful. We look to others to confirm our existence, our worth, our identity. This creates a vicious cycle where we are simultaneously imprisoned by others' perceptions and dependent on them for our sense of self. We cannot simply ignore what others think of us because their opinions shape our reality and our understanding of who we are. In Sartre's play, the characters realize they are in hell not because of fire or physical torture, but because they are locked in a room together for eternity, unable to escape each other's judgments. Each person becomes the torturer of the other simply by existing and observing. There is no privacy, no escape from being seen and defined by another consciousness. The concept suggests that authentic freedom and self-definition are nearly impossible in a social world. We are always performing for an audience, always aware of being watched and evaluated. Our hell is not a place we go after death. It is the inescapable condition of living among other conscious beings who see us, judge us, and define us in ways we cannot control. Sadaen Nihilism. Sadaen Nihilism is a deeply troubling philosophical position that emerges from the writings of the Marquis de Sade, an 18th-century French aristocrat whose name gave us the word sadism. This philosophy combines the bleakest elements of nihilism with a radical, immoral approach to human behavior that rejects all conventional ethics and embraces cruelty and self-gratification as the only honest responses to a meaningless universe. At its core, Sadaen nihilism begins with the premise that there is no God, no inherent meaning, and no objective moral law governing the universe. Nature itself is portrayed as a force of destruction and indifference, constantly creating and annihilating without purpose or compassion. If nature operates through violence, predation, and the strong dominating the weak, then the Sadaen nihilist argues that humans are simply following natural law when they pursue their own pleasure at any cost, even if it causes suffering to others. What makes this philosophy particularly disturbing is its logical consistency within its own framework. If there truly is no God and no objective morality, if we are simply biological machines in an indifferent universe, then why should we restrain our desires? Why should we care about the suffering of others if empathy is just a social construct? The Sadaen nihilist sees conventional morality as nothing more than a tool used by the weak to constrain the strong. They argue that notions of good and evil, virtue and vice, are artificial inventions designed to make people feel guilty for pursuing their natural impulses. This philosophy doesn't just accept nihilism's conclusion that life has no inherent meaning. It actively celebrates the freedom that this meaninglessness supposedly provides. Without divine judgment or cosmic justice, the Sadaen nihilist believes they are free to pursue absolute liberty, which in practice means indulging every desire without regard for consequences or the well-being of others. Pain and pleasure become equally valid experiences to inflict or pursue, as there is no higher authority to say otherwise. The most chilling aspect of Sadaen nihilism is how it transforms the absence of meaning into a justification for cruelty. Rather than responding to meaninglessness with despair, compassion, or the creation of personal meaning, it embraces a kind of aggressive hedonism where other people become mere instruments for one's own gratification. It represents perhaps the darkest possible response to the death of God and traditional values, a philosophy that mistakes the absence of cosmic meaning for permission to abandon all human decency. Dysteleological suffering. Dysteleological suffering refers to pain and anguish that serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. The term comes from the Greek word telos, meaning purpose or end goal. The prefix dys means bad or abnormal. So dysteleological literally means without proper purpose or design. This concept challenges one of humanity's most comforting beliefs, the idea that suffering happens for a reason, that pain makes us stronger, or that hardship teaches us valuable lessons. The philosophy behind dysteleological suffering forces us to confront a harsh reality. Much of the pain experienced in the world serves no redemptive function at all. A child born with a painful genetic disease who dies before their first birthday gains no wisdom from their suffering. An animal torn apart by predators doesn't grow from the experience. A person tortured by a random act of violence receives no spiritual enlightenment from their trauma. The suffering simply exists, brutal and meaningless, serving no greater plan or purpose. This concept becomes especially disturbing when we consider how much mental energy humans expend trying to find meaning in their pain. We tell ourselves that struggles build character, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, that everything happens for a reason. These narratives help us cope with difficulty and trauma. But dysteleological suffering strips away these comforting stories and presents suffering in its rawest form, as purposeless destruction of well-being. Religious and spiritual frameworks often struggle with this concept because they typically assert that suffering serves some divine purpose, whether as a test of faith, punishment for sin, or opportunity for spiritual growth. Dysteleological suffering challenges these explanations by pointing to countless examples of pain that cannot possibly serve any constructive purpose. How does the suffering of infants serve any plan? What lesson is learned by someone who dies instantly in a random accident? What character is built by dementia that destroys a person's mind before killing them? The philosopher William James explored this idea when discussing the problem of evil. He noted that much suffering in the world appears excessive and unnecessary, going far beyond what would be needed if pain were simply meant to teach us lessons or help us grow. Nature seems designed not with benevolent purpose but with indifference, producing suffering as a mere byproduct of physical processes that care nothing for consciousness or well-being. What makes Dysteleological suffering so philosophically troubling is that it suggests we live in a universe fundamentally indifferent to our pain. There is no cosmic balance being maintained, no greater good being served, no hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. Suffering exists simply because the physical laws of the universe permit it, and consciousness has the misfortune of being able to experience it. We are biological beings in a mechanical universe, and our pain matters to no one and nothing beyond ourselves and those who care about us. Abjection. Abjection is a philosophical and psychological concept that describes our visceral reaction to things that challenge the boundary between ourselves and the outside world, between life and death, between the human and the non-human. Developed extensively by philosopher Julia Kristeva, abjection refers to the experience of encountering something that fundamentally disturbs our sense of identity and order. It provokes a deep, often physical revulsion because it reminds us of our own fragility, mortality, and the thinness of the line separating the living self from decay and dissolution. The abject is not simply something we dislike or find unpleasant. It is something that threatens the very boundaries we use to define ourselves as separate, coherent beings. Common examples of the abject include bodily fluids like blood, vomit, or excrement, decomposing flesh, open wounds, and corpses. These things horrify us not because they are inherently evil or dangerous, but because they represent parts of ourselves that we normally keep hidden or expelled. They are simultaneously us and not us, familiar yet utterly foreign. What makes abjection so disturbing is that it reveals the artificial nature of the boundaries we construct to maintain our sense of self. We like to think of ourselves as unified, clean, and separate from the disgusting material world. But abjection reminds us that we are bodies, that we leak and decay, that the inside of our bodies is filled with substances we find revolting when they appear on the outside. A corpse is particularly abject because it shows us what we will become, a thing that was once a person but is now just deteriorating matter. Kristeva argued that we experience abjection when we encounter something that should be expelled or kept at a distance but instead confronts us directly. The most profound abjection occurs with the corpse because it represents the ultimate breakdown of the distinction between subject and object, between a person and a thing. The dead body was once alive like us, but now it is just meat, rotting and meaningless. This confrontation with mortality and materiality shakes our fundamental sense of who and what we are. Abjection also has social and cultural dimensions. We abject certain people, behaviors, or groups, treating them as pollution or contamination that threatens social order. Throughout history, societies have marked certain individuals or groups as abject, pushing them to the margins because they supposedly threaten the purity or integrity of the community. This reveals how the psychological mechanism of abjection can become a tool of oppression and dehumanization. The concept of abjection is disturbing because it shows us that our identity is fragile and our disgust is intimately connected to our fear of our own bodily reality. We are not transcendent minds or eternal souls, we are flesh and fluids, constantly producing and expelling waste, constantly moving toward death and decomposition. Abjection is the horror of recognizing ourselves in what we most desperately want to reject. God is dead. This is perhaps the most famous and misunderstood phrase in all of philosophy, spoken by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the late 19th century. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he was not making a theological claim about whether a divine being actually exists. Instead, he was diagnosing a profound cultural and psychological crisis in Western civilization. He was announcing that the moral and metaphysical foundation upon which European society had built itself for nearly 2,000 years had collapsed, and most people had not yet realized the catastrophic implications of this collapse. For centuries, God served as the ultimate source of meaning, morality, and purpose in Western culture. The existence of God provided answers to life's most fundamental questions. Why are we here? What should we do? What happens when we die? How should we treat each other? All of these questions were answered by reference to divine will, divine law, and divine purpose. Even people who were not particularly religious lived in a world where Christian values and Christian metaphysics provided the invisible architecture of meaning. But by Nietzsche's time, advances in science, philosophy, and critical thinking had eroded belief in the literal truth of religious doctrine. People no longer truly believed in God with the unquestioning faith of their ancestors. What Nietzsche found disturbing was not the loss of belief itself, but rather that people continued to act as though the Christian moral system still made sense even after abandoning its theological foundation. They had killed God but were still trying to live by his rules without understanding that those rules only made sense if God existed. This is what makes the death of God so philosophically troubling. If there is no God, then there is no cosmic purpose to existence, no objective moral law written into the fabric of reality, no guarantee of justice or meaning. We are alone in an indifferent universe, free to create our own values but also stripped of any absolute foundation for those values. Nietzsche believed that most people were not psychologically prepared for this freedom and this responsibility. Without God, the old morality becomes arbitrary, but most people lack the courage to create new values. The death of God leads to what Nietzsche called nihilism, the belief that nothing has intrinsic meaning or value. If there is no divine plan, then perhaps everything is permitted. Perhaps nothing matters at all. This realization can lead to despair, cynicism, and the collapse of all values. Nietzsche worried that Western civilization would descend into meaninglessness and chaos once people fully grasped that God was dead. What makes this concept truly disturbing is the question it leaves us with. If God is dead, and we have killed him, what do we do now? How do we create meaning in a meaningless universe? How do we justify morality without divine command? Nietzsche believed we must become strong enough to create our own values and give life meaning through our actions, but he recognized that most people would find this burden unbearable. Being and Nothingness. Being and Nothingness is the title of Jean-Paul Sartre's monumental philosophical work, but it also captures a fundamental tension at the heart of human existence. This concept explores the disturbing gap between what we are and what we are not, between our factual existence as physical beings and our radical freedom to define ourselves. Sartre argued that human consciousness is unique because it is characterized by nothingness, by an emptiness at its core that allows us to imagine what is not, to transcend our current situation, and to be free. This freedom, however, is not a gift but a curse that we can never escape. Unlike objects in the world, which simply are what they are, humans possess consciousness that is always reaching beyond itself. A rock is simply a rock, complete and self-identical. But a human being is never simply what they are at any given moment. We are constantly projecting ourselves into the future, imagining possibilities, and defining ourselves through our choices. This creates a fundamental instability in human existence. We can never coincide perfectly with ourselves the way objects do. There is always a gap, a nothingness, between what we are and what we might become. This nothingness at the core of consciousness is what gives us freedom, but it also creates profound anxiety. We are condemned to be free, as Sartre famously put it. We cannot escape the burden of choosing who we will be and what meaning our lives will have. Every moment demands that we define ourselves through our actions, and we can never appeal to our past, our circumstances, or our nature as excuses for our choices. We are always more than our past, always capable of choosing differently, and this radical freedom is terrifying. What makes this concept particularly disturbing is Sartre's idea of bad faith, the ways we try to deceive ourselves about our freedom. We pretend to be fixed things with definite essences rather than acknowledging the nothingness at our core. We hide behind social roles, claiming we must act a certain way because we are a teacher, a parent, or a soldier. We blame our circumstances, our upbringing, or our psychology for our choices. But Sartre insists these are all forms of self-deception. We are always free, always responsible, always facing the abyss of nothingness that allows us to be other than what we are. The relationship between being and nothingness also reveals the fundamental absurdity of human existence. We exist, we have being, we are thrown into a world we did not choose. Yet our consciousness is characterized by nothingness, by the ability to negate, to imagine what is not, to transcend our situation. We are beings who carry nothingness within ourselves. This creates an unbridgeable gap between consciousness and the world, between our freedom and our facticity, between what we are and what we might be. The disturbing conclusion is that we can never achieve the stable, complete existence we crave. We are always incomplete, always in question, always burdened with the responsibility of creating ourselves from nothing in every moment of our lives. Eternal torment of samsara. The eternal torment of samsara is a concept from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy that describes the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth as a fundamentally unsatisfactory and suffering-filled process from which all sentient beings desperately need to escape. Samsara is not simply reincarnation in the sense of getting multiple chances at life. Instead, it is portrayed as a trap, an endless wheel of existence that keeps consciousness bound to suffering across countless lifetimes. What makes this concept particularly disturbing is the implication that ordinary existence itself, the very fact of being alive and experiencing the world, is inherently a form of torment. In the Buddhist understanding, life is characterized by dukkha, often translated as suffering but more accurately meaning unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfaction. Every moment of existence contains within it the seeds of suffering because everything is impermanent. Whatever pleasure we experience is temporary and will inevitably end. Whatever we love will eventually be lost. Our own bodies age, sicken, and die. We are constantly craving things we do not have and clinging to things we cannot keep. This is not just true for one lifetime but for countless lifetimes stretching backward and forward through eternity. The truly horrifying aspect of samsara is its mindless repetition. We are born, we suffer the pains of existence, we die, and then we are reborn to do it all over again. Our actions, driven by ignorance and craving, create karma that binds us to this wheel. Each life generates the causes for the next life, and the cycle continues without end unless we achieve enlightenment. We have been caught in this cycle for beginningless time, experiencing every possible form of existence, being born as humans, animals, gods, demons, and tormented beings in hell realms, only to die and be reborn again and again. What makes samsara a form of torment rather than simply neutral existence is that consciousness itself is portrayed as problematic. As long as we are separate selves experiencing the world through the illusion of ego, we will suffer. Desire and aversion, the fundamental responses of consciousness to experience, are precisely what keep us trapped. We want what we do not have, we reject what we do have, and we are never satisfied. Even moments of pleasure are tinged with suffering because we know they will end and we already begin to cling to them or fear their loss. The concept becomes even more disturbing when we consider that most beings trapped in samsara are not even aware they are trapped. They mistake the temporary pleasures of existence for genuine happiness. They pursue goals, build relationships, and create meaning without realizing that all of it is just more fuel for the fire that keeps them bound to the wheel. Ignorance is not just a lack of knowledge but a fundamental misperception of reality that ensures continued suffering. The Buddhist and Hindu traditions offer paths to escape samsara through enlightenment or liberation, but the fact that such escape is necessary implies something deeply unsettling about the nature of existence itself. Life is not a gift to be celebrated but a prison to be escaped. The shadow. The shadow is a concept developed by Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung that refers to the dark, unconscious aspect of the personality that contains all the traits, desires, and impulses we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The shadow is everything we cannot accept about who we are, everything we have repressed, denied, or hidden away because it conflicts with our conscious self-image. What makes this concept deeply disturbing is the realization that we are not who we think we are, that beneath our carefully constructed identity lurks a stranger whose existence we have spent our entire lives denying. From early childhood, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable to our parents, our culture, and our society. We are rewarded for certain behaviors and punished for others. Gradually, we develop a persona, a social mask that represents who we want to be seen as. The traits that do not fit this acceptable image, our aggression, our selfishness, our cruelty, our perverse desires, our weaknesses, do not simply disappear. Instead, they are pushed down into the unconscious mind where they form the shadow. The more rigidly we define ourselves as good, moral, rational, and civilized, the more powerful and dangerous our shadow becomes. The shadow does not remain passive in the unconscious. It influences our behavior in ways we do not recognize or understand. It erupts in slips of the tongue, in dreams and fantasies, in irrational anger or inexplicable attractions. Most disturbingly, we tend to project our shadow onto other people. The qualities we most despise in others are often the very qualities we have repressed in ourselves. When we feel intense hatred or disgust towards someone, when we see them as purely evil or contemptible, we are often seeing our own shadow reflected back at us. This is why people can commit terrible acts while maintaining an image of themselves as good and righteous. They have projected all their darkness onto others. Jung believed that the shadow contains not only negative qualities but also positive potentials that we have repressed because they threatened our self-image or did not fit social expectations. Someone raised to be meek and passive might have repressed their strength and assertiveness. Someone taught that emotions are weakness might have buried their capacity for vulnerability and connection. The shadow is not simply evil, it is everything we are not allowed to be, and that can include vitality, creativity, and authenticity. What makes the shadow concept particularly unsettling is that we can never fully eliminate it. We can only become aware of it, acknowledge it, and integrate it into our conscious personality. This process, which Jung called shadow work, requires us to confront the most unacceptable truths about ourselves. It means admitting that we are capable of the same cruelty, selfishness, and darkness that we condemn in others. It means recognizing that the person we present to the world is only half the story, and the other half is hidden in darkness. The shadow also has collective dimensions. Societies and cultures have collective shadows containing everything that culture has deemed unacceptable. These collective shadows can erupt in mass violence, scapegoating, and atrocities, as entire groups project their darkness onto others and commit horrors while believing themselves righteous. Misanthropy. Misanthropy is the general hatred, distrust, or contempt for humanity as a whole. A misanthrope is someone who has concluded that human beings are fundamentally flawed, corrupt, cruel, or worthless, and that the world would be better off without us. What makes misanthropy philosophically disturbing is not simply that it represents a negative view of humanity, but that it often emerges from careful observation of human behavior and history. The misanthrope looks at war, genocide, environmental destruction, cruelty, hypocrisy, and selfishness, and concludes that these are not aberrations but expressions of humanity's true nature. Unlike cynicism, which doubts human motives, or pessimism, which expects bad outcomes, misanthropy is a deeper rejection of human worth itself. The philosophical foundations of misanthropy often rest on the observation that humans are uniquely capable of evil. Animals kill for food or territory, acting on instinct without malice. But humans torture, enslave, and destroy each other for pleasure, for ideology, for profit, or for no reason at all. We are capable of imagining the suffering we cause, of knowing it is wrong, and yet we do it anyway. We create elaborate justifications for our cruelty. We build systems of oppression and tell ourselves they are natural or necessary. We destroy the environment that sustains us while knowing full well what we are doing. This combination of intelligence and depravity is what the misanthrope finds uniquely contemptible about humanity. History provides endless evidence for the misanthropic worldview. Every generation produces new atrocities. Every society, no matter how civilized it claims to be, has its victims, its outcasts, its oppressed. We repeat the same mistakes across centuries, dressed up in new ideologies but fundamentally unchanged. We claim to value truth but embrace comforting lies. We speak of love and compassion while treating each other with callousness and indifference. The misanthrope sees this pattern not as something that can be fixed through education or reform, but as an expression of what humans fundamentally are. What makes misanthropy particularly disturbing is that it can be deeply rational and well justified. The misanthrope is not necessarily delusional or ignorant. Often, They have looked closely at human nature and human history and drawn conclusions that are difficult to refute. When confronted with evidence of human goodness, acts of kindness, self-sacrifice, or progress, the misanthrope can point out that these are exceptions that prove the rule, or worse, that even our good acts are tainted by selfishness, performed for social approval, moral satisfaction, or to ease our guilt. The misanthrope also recognizes humanity's capacity for self-deception. We are creatures who can commit monstrous acts while believing ourselves to be good. We exploit and harm others while constructing narratives that justify our actions. We are capable of extraordinary cognitive dissonance, holding contradictory beliefs without discomfort. This ability to lie to ourselves about who and what we are is perhaps what the misanthrope finds most contemptible. At least other predators are honest about what they are. The deepest problem with misanthropy is that the misanthrope is themselves human, which creates a profound internal contradiction. To hate humanity is to hate oneself. The misanthrope either must exempt themselves from their general condemnation, which seems hypocritical, or must include themselves in the category of contemptible beings, which leads to self-loathing and despair. This makes misanthropy not just a philosophical position but a form of existential poison. Human sacrifice mythos. Human sacrifice mythos refers to the disturbing reality that across virtually every ancient civilization and culture, human beings developed elaborate religious and social systems that required the ritual killing of other humans to appease gods, ensure prosperity, maintain cosmic order, or achieve spiritual goals. This is not simply a historical curiosity but a profound philosophical problem. It reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature and our relationship with the sacred. The fact that countless societies, separated by vast distances and developing independently, all arrived at the conclusion that killing humans was not only acceptable but spiritually necessary, suggests something fundamental and dark about how human consciousness constructs meaning and confronts existential terror. The practice of human sacrifice was not the work of a few deranged individuals but was central to some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Aztecs believed the sun would not rise without regular offerings of human hearts. The ancient Carthaginians sacrificed children to ensure military victory and divine favor. Norse cultures practiced ritual killings to honor gods and accompany leaders into the afterlife. Chinese dynasties buried servants and wives alive with deceased emperors. Celtic druids conducted elaborate human sacrifices to read omens and ensure good harvests. These were not barbaric exceptions but core religious practices embedded in complex societies with art, architecture, philosophy, and law. What makes the human sacrifice mythos philosophically disturbing is that it demonstrates how easily humans can be convinced that killing the innocent serves a greater good. The victims of these sacrifices were often willing participants, indoctrinated from birth to believe their deaths had cosmic significance. Some cultures considered being chosen for sacrifice a great honor. This reveals the terrifying power of cultural narratives to override the most basic human instinct for survival. It shows how meaning-making systems can transform murder into virtue, can make the unbearable seem necessary, even beautiful. The psychological mechanisms behind human sacrifice reveal uncomfortable truths about how we construct social order and deal with anxiety. Anthropologists suggest that sacrifice served to unify communities through shared participation in transgression, to channel violence outward in controlled ways, to reinforce social hierarchies by demonstrating who has the power of life and death, and to provide an illusion of control over uncontrollable forces like weather, disease, and death itself. In other words, we killed each other to feel less afraid, to feel connected, to feel that the universe could be negotiated with through blood. The mythos aspect refers not just to the practices themselves but to the stories and belief systems that justified them. These were not random acts of violence but carefully ritualized performances embedded in complex cosmologies. The Aztecs believed they were partners with the gods in maintaining the universe. Without sacrifice, existence itself would end. This transforms murder into an act of cosmic necessity, even heroism. The narrative structure makes the unbearable not only bearable but sacred. What haunts us about human sacrifice is the question of whether we have truly moved beyond it or simply found new forms. Modern societies still send young people to die in wars justified by national mythologies. We allow preventable deaths through economic systems we describe as natural or inevitable. We sacrifice future generations to present comfort through environmental destruction. The mythos may have changed, but the underlying pattern of making some deaths acceptable, even necessary, for the supposed benefit of others remains disturbingly familiar. The ancient practice holds up a mirror to our own capacity to rationalize cruelty when wrapped in sufficiently compelling narratives. Death drive. The death drive, or thanatos, is one of Sigmund Freud's most controversial and disturbing psychological concepts. Late in his career, Freud proposed that alongside our life instincts, our desires for pleasure, connection, and survival, there exists within all of us a fundamental drive toward destruction, dissolution, and ultimately death itself. This is not simply a wish to die, but rather a deep, unconscious compulsion to return to a state of non-existence, to reduce tension to zero, to undo the complex organization of life and return to inorganic simplicity. The death drive suggests that we are not simply fighting against death from the outside, but that we carry within us an impulse toward our own annihilation. Freud developed this concept after observing repetitive, self-destructive behaviors that could not be explained by the pleasure principle alone. Why do people repeatedly return to painful situations? Why do trauma victims relive their worst experiences? Why do we engage in behaviors we know will harm us? Why does humanity seem drawn to violence and destruction on both individual and collective scales? Freud concluded that there must be something in human psychology that seeks not pleasure but obliteration, a drive that works silently beneath consciousness to pull us toward death. The death drive manifests in both subtle and dramatic ways. On the individual level, it appears in self-destructive behaviors, addictions, needless risk-taking, and a compulsion to repeat painful patterns. It shows itself in the way we sabotage our own happiness, destroy relationships that make us vulnerable, and find ways to undermine our own success. More dramatically, it emerges in suicide, self-harm, and the various ways people slowly kill themselves through neglect or dangerous choices. The death drive is not rational or conscious, it operates beneath awareness, as a biological and psychological force pulling us back toward the inorganic state from which life emerged. On a collective level, the death drive manifests in humanity's capacity for violence and destruction. War, genocide, torture, and cruelty can be understood not just as means to achieve goals but as expressions of this fundamental destructive instinct. Freud wrote about the death drive while witnessing the horrors of World War I, where millions of people enthusiastically marched toward mechanical slaughter. How else to explain such willing participation in mass death except through a drive that seeks destruction itself? The development of nuclear weapons, capable of ending all human life, represents perhaps the ultimate expression of the collective death drive. What makes the death drive philosophically disturbing is that it suggests we are fundamentally divided against ourselves. We are not unified beings striving toward life and happiness, but rather battlegrounds where life and death instincts war within us constantly. Every act of creation contains within it the seeds of destruction. Every relationship carries the potential for harm. Our very aliveness is shadowed by an attraction to non-being. We are, in essence, organisms that contain their own opposition, beings that move toward life while simultaneously being pulled toward death. The concept also challenges our comforting notions about human nature and progress. If the death drive is fundamental to human psychology, then violence and destruction are not aberrations that can be eliminated through better education or social organization. They are built into us at the deepest level. Civilization itself, according to Freud, requires us to redirect the death drive outward toward others or sublimate it into less destructive forms, but the drive itself cannot be eliminated. It will always find expression, whether in aggression toward others or turned inward against ourselves. Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. It is the conclusion that there are no objective truths, no moral absolutes, and no cosmic significance to human existence. The term comes from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing, and that captures the essence of this worldview. Nihilism looks at the universe and sees only emptiness where humans desperately want to find meaning. It is perhaps the most fundamentally disturbing philosophical position because it strips away every comforting belief system we use to make sense of our lives. At its core, nihilism rejects the foundations upon which most people build their lives. Religious nihilism denies that God exists or that there is any divine purpose to existence. Moral nihilism claims that there is no objective right or wrong, that ethics are simply human inventions with no foundation in reality. Existential nihilism asserts that life itself has no intrinsic meaning or purpose beyond what we arbitrarily assign to it. These are not merely academic positions but conclusions that, if truly accepted, seem to undermine the possibility of living a meaningful life. The path to nihilism often begins with the questioning of traditional sources of meaning. When people lose faith in religion, they might turn to reason and science for answers. But science describes how things work, not why they matter. It reveals a universe of physical laws and mechanical processes that care nothing for human values or purposes. The universe is not designed for us. It has no plan. Stars explode, galaxies collide, species go extinct, and none of it means anything beyond the physical facts of what happened. We are biological accidents on a tiny planet orbiting an average star in an unremarkable galaxy, and when we die, the universe will not notice or care. Moral nihilism is particularly unsettling because it challenges our deepest convictions about right and wrong. We feel strongly that certain actions are good and others are evil, but nihilism asks what grounds these feelings. If there is no God to define morality, and if evolution simply programmed us with instincts that helped our ancestors survive, then morality is just useful fiction. Murder feels wrong, but that is just because humans who cooperated survived better than those who did not. There is no cosmic law being violated, no objective evil being committed. It is all just preferences and social conditioning. The disturbing implication of nihilism is that nothing ultimately matters. Your achievements, your relationships, your suffering, your joy, all of it is cosmically insignificant and will be forgotten. You could dedicate your life to helping others or to causing harm, and from the perspective of an indifferent universe, there is no difference. Both lives amount to nothing in the end. The heat death of the universe will erase all traces of human civilization as if we never existed. Some philosophers have tried to embrace nihilism as liberating rather than despairing. If nothing has inherent meaning, then we are free to create our own meaning without being constrained by cosmic purposes or divine commands. But this response often feels like whistling in the dark. The freedom to create meaning does not solve the problem that the meaning we create is arbitrary and ultimately groundless. We are trying to build castles on quicksand, and we know it. Radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is the philosophical position that we cannot be certain of anything, that all of our beliefs about reality, knowledge, and even our own existence might be fundamentally mistaken. Unlike ordinary skepticism, which questions specific claims or asks for evidence, radical skepticism challenges the very possibility of knowledge itself. It asks how we can trust our senses, our reasoning, our memories, or any method we use to determine what is true. The disturbing conclusion of radical skepticism is that we might be trapped in a state of permanent uncertainty, unable to escape doubt about even the most basic facts of our existence. The classic formulation of radical skepticism comes from the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, who proposed the thought experiment of an evil demon that could be deceiving us about everything we experience. How do you know you are not dreaming right now? How do you know your memories are real and not implanted? How do you know that the external world exists at all rather than being an elaborate illusion created by your mind or by some malevolent force? Descartes used this radical doubt as a method to find something absolutely certain, but the skeptical challenge he raised continues to haunt philosophy. Modern versions of radical skepticism include the brain in that scenario. Imagine that you are not a person with a body living in the real world, but rather a disembodied brain floating in a vat of nutrients while a supercomputer feeds electrical impulses directly into your neurons, creating the complete illusion of a normal life. Every sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell you have ever experienced would be artificial, generated by the computer. Every person you have ever known would be a simulation. Your entire life would be a sophisticated virtual reality. The disturbing part is that there is no way to prove this is not the case. Any evidence you might gather would itself be part of the simulation. What makes radical skepticism philosophically troubling is that it seems irrefutable. Every argument you make against it relies on assumptions that skepticism calls into question. You might say, I trust my senses because they have been reliable in the past, but how do you know your memories of past reliability are accurate? You might appeal to scientific methods or logical reasoning, but how do you know your reasoning processes are reliable rather than systematically flawed? Every foundation you try to build knowledge upon can be questioned, leading to an infinite regress where nothing can ever be established with certainty. The practical implications of radical skepticism are paralyzing. If we truly cannot know anything with certainty, then how should we live? How do we make decisions? How do we distinguish between reality and illusion, between truth and falsehood? Most people deal with radical skepticism by ignoring it, living as if their basic beliefs about reality are true even though they cannot prove them. But this feels like a kind of philosophical cowardice, choosing comfortable assumptions over intellectual honesty. Some philosophers argue that radical skepticism is self-defeating because the skeptic must claim to know that nothing can be known, which is itself a knowledge claim. Others suggest that we must accept some basic assumptions without proof as the necessary foundation for any reasoning at all. But these responses never quite dispel the original doubt. The radical skeptic can always respond that they are not claiming to know that knowledge is impossible, only pointing out that we cannot justify our beliefs, that we live in a state of uncertainty whether we acknowledge it or not. The truly disturbing aspect of radical skepticism is that it might be correct. We might indeed be brains in vats, or living in a simulation, or deceived by an evil demon, or trapped in some other scenario where our entire understanding of reality is wrong. And there would be no way to discover this truth because our very methods of discovery are what is being called into question. The silence of God. The silence of God is a profound theological and philosophical concept that refers to the disturbing absence of divine communication or intervention in a world filled with suffering and injustice. Throughout human history, people have cried out to God in moments of desperation, pain, and existential crisis, only to be met with what feels like absolute silence. No voice from heaven answers prayers. No miraculous intervention stops atrocities. No clear sign reveals divine will or purpose. This silence becomes particularly disturbing when we consider the immense suffering that occurs daily, suffering that an all-powerful, all-loving God could presumably prevent but apparently chooses not to. The concept gained particular intensity during and after the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews and millions of others were systematically murdered while the heavens remained silent. Theologians and survivors wrestled with the question of where God was during this unprecedented evil. Some concluded that God had hidden his face, turned away from humanity. Others suggested that God was present but powerless, suffering alongside humanity but unable to intervene. Still others concluded that the silence proved God never existed at all, that humanity had been praying to an empty sky. The philosopher and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel wrote powerfully about this silence, describing how faith was murdered in the concentration camps alongside innocent victims whose prayers went unanswered. But the silence of God is not limited to extreme historical atrocities. It is experienced daily by individuals facing personal tragedies. A parent prays desperately for their dying child, and the child dies anyway. A victim of abuse begs for deliverance, and the abuse continues. People suffering from mental illness, addiction, or despair cry out for help and receive no response they can recognize. The silence is not just an absence of miraculous intervention but an absence of any clear communication. What makes the silence of God philosophically disturbing is that it contradicts the nature of God as described in most religious traditions. If God is all-knowing, he must be aware of human suffering. If God is all-powerful, he must be capable of responding. If God is all-loving, he should be motivated to help. Yet the silence continues. This creates what philosophers call the problem of evil, but focus specifically on the relational aspect. It is not just that evil exists, but that God seems absent or indifferent when we most desperately need him. Various theological responses attempt to explain this silence. Some argue that God speaks in subtle ways we fail to recognize, that the silence is really our inability to hear. Others suggest that divine silence is pedagogical, meant to develop human autonomy and spiritual maturity. Still others embrace the concept of a hidden God, arguing that divine mystery requires periods of absence. But none of these explanations fully address the existential anguish of the person crying out in genuine need and receiving no discernible response. The silence feels like abandonment, like a fundamental breach of the covenant between the divine and the human. It raises the terrifying possibility that we are alone in the universe, that our prayers echo in empty space, and that whatever God may be, he is not listening. Antinatalism. Antinatalism is the philosophical position that it is morally wrong to bring new human beings into existence. Antinatalists argue that procreation causes harm because it subjects a new person to the inevitable suffering, pain, and eventual death that come with being alive. This is not simply a personal choice to remain childless, but a moral claim that applies to everyone. According to antinatalism, the kindest thing we can do for potential future people is to never bring them into existence. The concept is disturbing because it challenges one of the most fundamental human drives, the creation of new life, and labels it as an ethical failure. Philosopher David Benatar articulated an influential argument for antinatalism based on an asymmetry between pleasure and pain. He argues that the presence of pain is bad, while the presence of pleasure is good. However, the absence of pain is good even if there is no one to enjoy that absence, while the absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone who is deprived of it. For a person who is never born, there is no deprivation, no one who misses out on good things. But there is the absence of all suffering that person would have experienced. Therefore, not bringing someone into existence prevents guaranteed suffering without creating actual deprivation. Antinatalists point to the inevitability of suffering in human life. Every person who is born will experience physical pain, illness, emotional distress, disappointment, loss, and fear. They will watch loved ones die. They will experience bodily decline and face mortality with terror or anguish. No matter how fortunate someone's life may be, it will contain suffering and end in death. By choosing to procreate, parents guarantee their child will experience these harms. The antinatalist argues we cannot obtain consent from a person before they exist, so bringing them into a world where suffering is guaranteed is an imposition of harm without permission. The concept becomes more disturbing when considering the current state of the world. Antinatalists argue that bringing children into a world facing climate catastrophe, resource depletion, and potential civilizational collapse is especially cruel. We are subjecting them not just to ordinary sufferings but to a future that may be significantly worse than the present. Yet people continue to reproduce without seriously considering whether it is ethical. Critics argue that life also contains joy, beauty, love, and meaning that make existence worthwhile despite suffering. They claim most people are glad to be alive and would choose existence over non-existence. But antinatalists respond this is irrelevant. Once someone exists, they develop a strong preference for continued existence and fear of death. This does not justify the original decision to create them. A person cannot miss a life they never had, but they can suffer in the life they were given. The logical conclusion of antinatalism, if universally accepted, would be human extinction through voluntary childlessness. This strikes many as absurd or tragic, but antinatalists argue it would be a peaceful end to human suffering, a closing of the door on billions of years of pain and death. The disturbing power of antinatalism lies in its challenge to our deepest assumptions about the value of life itself. Ontological suffering. Ontological suffering refers to the pain and anguish inherent to existence itself, not caused by any particular circumstance that could be fixed or avoided. The term comes from ontology, the philosophical study of being and existence. Ontological suffering suggests that simply by existing, by having consciousness and being aware of ourselves as finite beings in an indifferent universe, we are condemned to a fundamental level of suffering that cannot be eliminated through better conditions, therapy, or social reform. This is suffering built into the very structure of what it means to be a conscious, self-aware creature. This concept differs from circumstantial suffering, which comes from specific problems like poverty, illness, or loss. Circumstantial suffering can theoretically be addressed or reduced. If you are suffering from hunger, food relieves it. If you are lonely, connection eases it. But ontological suffering persists regardless of external circumstances. Even a person with wealth, health, and loving relationships still faces existential anxieties that come with consciousness. They still know they will die. They still experience the gap between who they are and who they wish to be. They still face the burden of freedom and choices that can never be unmade. The roots of ontological suffering lie in several features of human existence. First, we are mortal and we know it. Unlike animals living in the present moment, humans are cursed with awareness of our eventual non-existence. This knowledge haunts us, creating background anxiety that colors all experience. Second, we are self-aware in ways that create painful division. We observe ourselves from outside, judge ourselves, feel shame and inadequacy. We are never simply what we are but always in question, always falling short of some ideal. Third, we are free but this freedom is a burden. We must constantly choose, and our choices define us in ways we cannot escape. Philosophers like Heidegger and Kierkegaard explored aspects of ontological suffering. Heidegger wrote about anxiety from confronting our being toward death, the fundamental fact that we are beings who will cease to be. Kierkegaard described despair from being a self, from painful consciousness of existing as a particular individual. Both suggested this existential anguish is not a psychological problem to cure but a fundamental condition of human existence. The Buddhist tradition has perhaps the most developed understanding of ontological suffering through the concept of dukkha. Buddhism teaches that all conditioned existence involves suffering because everything is impermanent and we cling to things that cannot last. Even pleasure contains suffering because we know it will end. Even happy moments are tinged with awareness of their transience. This is not pessimism but clear-eyed recognition that the very structure of existence, of being a separate self experiencing time and change, inherently involves dissatisfaction and pain. What makes ontological suffering so disturbing is its inescapability. You cannot fix it by changing circumstances because it is not about circumstances. You cannot think your way out because thinking itself is part of the problem. You are trapped in existence, in consciousness, in selfhood, and these very things that make you human are also the source of inescapable anguish. Moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the philosophical position that there are no objective moral truths, no inherent right or wrong, and no ethical facts that exist independently of human opinion. According to moral nihilism, when we say that murder is wrong or kindness is good, we are not describing objective features of reality but merely expressing personal preferences, cultural conditioning, or evolutionary programming. Morality is an invention, a useful fiction that societies create to coordinate behavior, but it has no foundation in the nature of the universe. This is deeply disturbing because it suggests that our strongest moral convictions, the beliefs we would die for or kill for, are ultimately no more objectively true than preferences for chocolate over vanilla. The argument for moral nihilism often begins by asking where moral truths would come from if they existed. Religious answers point to God as the source of morality, but if God does not exist, or if different religions contradict each other about what God commands, then this foundation crumbles. Some philosophers argue that reason alone can discover moral truths, but moral nihilists respond that reason can only tell us how to achieve our goals, not which goals we ought to have. Science describes what is, not what ought to be. You cannot derive values from facts, cannot get an ought from an is. If moral nihilism is true, then our moral emotions, our feelings of outrage at injustice or guilt over wrongdoing, are evolutionary adaptations rather than responses to genuine moral facts. We feel that certain actions are wrong because humans who had such feelings cooperated better and survived more successfully. But these feelings do not track anything real in the external world. They are like the feeling that sugar tastes good, a subjective response rather than an objective truth. This means that when we condemn historical atrocities or contemporary injustices, we are ultimately just expressing disapproval, not identifying genuine moral wrongs. The implications of moral nihilism are profoundly unsettling. If there is no objective morality, then on what basis can we criticize any action or belief system? A moral nihilist might say we can still have personal preferences and social agreements about how to live together, but these carry no more weight than any other preferences. Someone who rejects these agreements is not actually doing anything wrong, they are just operating according to different preferences. The Nazi is not objectively evil, just following values we happen to disagree with. Most people find moral nihilism psychologically impossible to accept even if they cannot refute it intellectually. We seem hardwired to experience morality as objective, to feel that some things really are wrong regardless of anyone's opinion. But moral nihilism suggests this feeling is an illusion, that we are biological machines programmed to care about things that ultimately do not matter. We live as if morality is real while knowing, on reflection, that it might be nothing but a comforting lie we tell ourselves. Cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is a philosophical and literary concept that evokes dread not from immediate physical danger but from the realization that humanity is utterly insignificant in a vast, indifferent, and fundamentally incomprehensible universe. This genre, pioneered by writer H.P. Lovecraft, presents a vision where human concerns, human morality, and human existence are so trivial as to be beneath the notice of true forces governing the cosmos. The horror comes not from monsters that want to hurt us, but from recognition that we are less than insects to entities existing on scales we cannot comprehend, and our extinction would be as meaningless as the death of a single bacterium. Traditional horror deals with threats we can understand: vampires, serial killers, ghosts. These are frightening but comprehensible, operating on human scales with human-like motivations. Cosmic horror removes even this comfort. It presents beings and realities so alien that encountering them causes madness because the human mind cannot process what it experiences. The very structure of our perception and reasoning, everything making us human, is inadequate to grasp true reality. We are like ants trying to understand quantum physics, not just ignorant but fundamentally incapable of knowledge. The philosophical implications strike at our deepest need for meaning and significance. We want to believe human life matters, that our struggles and achievements have cosmic importance, that consciousness is somehow central to the universe. Cosmic horror says no. The universe is not designed for us or interested in us. The laws of physics care nothing for human welfare. If tomorrow an incomprehensible entity from beyond spacetime wiped out all life in our galaxy, it would be no more morally significant than a human stepping on an anthill. We flatter ourselves imagining we are important enough to be threatened. The truth is worse, we are not even important enough to threaten. Cosmic horror also suggests knowledge itself can be dangerous and destructive. The more we learn about true reality, the more we realize how fragile our existence is and how little we matter. Ignorance is not just bliss but sanity. Those who look too deeply into the abyss, who encounter truths about space, time, and existence contradicting our comforting assumptions, go mad from revelation. This inverts the Enlightenment ideal that knowledge is power and progress. Instead, knowledge is horror, and wisdom is understanding we are better off not knowing. The disturbing power of cosmic horror lies in its reflection of scientific cosmology. We now know the universe is billions of years old and incomprehensibly vast. Earth is a tiny rock orbiting an average star in an unremarkable galaxy. Humanity has existed for the blink of an eye and will vanish without trace in cosmic time. This is not fiction but fact. Cosmic horror simply takes this reality seriously and asks what it means for human meaning and significance. Negative Utilitarianism. Negative Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that prioritizes the reduction of suffering over the promotion of happiness. While classical utilitarianism seeks to maximize overall well-being by increasing pleasure and decreasing pain, negative utilitarianism argues that reducing suffering should be our primary or only moral concern. The reasoning is that suffering is more urgent, more morally significant, and more worthy of our attention than happiness. A world with less suffering is better than a world with more happiness but also more suffering. This concept becomes disturbing when we follow its logic to extreme conclusions that challenge our intuitions about the value of existence itself. The philosopher Karl Popper expressed a version of negative utilitarianism when he argued that human misery makes a more urgent moral claim on us than human happiness. We have a stronger duty to help someone in agony than to increase someone's pleasure. This seems intuitively correct in many contexts. If you could either save someone from torture or give someone a pleasant experience, it seems obvious you should prevent the torture. Suffering demands immediate response in a way that the absence of pleasure does not. However, negative utilitarianism leads to troubling implications when taken to its logical extreme. If preventing suffering is the only thing that matters morally, or matters far more than creating happiness, then the quickest and most efficient way to eliminate all suffering would be to eliminate all sentient life. A universe without consciousness would contain no suffering. Therefore, according to strict negative utilitarianism, human extinction, or even the destruction of all life would be morally preferable to continued existence with its inevitable suffering. This is sometimes called the benevolent world exploder problem, the idea that a button that painlessly ended all life would be the most ethical thing to press. Even less extreme versions of negative utilitarianism have disturbing implications. It suggests that a life containing both great joy and great suffering is worse than a life containing neither, even though most people would prefer to exist and experience both rather than not exist at all. It implies that creating new happy people does not improve the world unless it somehow reduces suffering for existing people. It prioritizes people who are suffering over those who are flourishing, potentially justifying redistributing resources away from happy people to slightly reduce the suffering of unhappy people, even if this reduces total well-being. The concept also raises questions about medical ethics and end-of-life decisions. If reducing suffering is paramount, does this justify euthanasia or even encourage it whenever someone experiences significant pain? Does it suggest we should prevent births to avoid the suffering those people would inevitably experience? These questions reveal how an ethical theory focused primarily on reducing suffering can conflict with other values we hold, like the intrinsic value of life, autonomy, and human flourishing. Determinism. Determinism is the philosophical view that every event, including every human action and decision, is the inevitable result of prior causes according to natural laws. In a deterministic universe, the present state of everything was necessitated by the past, and the future is already fixed by the present, even if we do not know what it will be. This means that what we experience as free will, our sense that we could have chosen differently, is an illusion. When you decided what to eat for breakfast, that decision was determined by your brain chemistry, your past experiences, your genetics, and countless factors stretching back to the beginning of the universe. You could not have chosen differently because all causes leading to your choice were already in place. The argument for determinism follows from basic principles of causation. Every physical event has causes. Your thoughts and decisions are physical events in your brain, the firing of neurons according to laws of physics and chemistry. Those neural events were caused by prior neural events, which were caused by earlier events, in an unbroken chain extending backward through your entire life, through your birth, through your parents' lives, through human evolution, through the formation of Earth, back to the Big Bang. At no point in this causal chain is there room for genuine freedom or choice. Everything that happens, happens because it must, given what came before. This creates a profound problem for our understanding of moral responsibility. If determinism is true, then murderers could not have done otherwise. Their actions were the inevitable result of their genetics, their upbringing, their brain chemistry, and their circumstances. Does it make sense to hold someone morally responsible, to praise or blame them, to punish or reward them, if they had no real choice? Our entire system of justice, our concepts of guilt and innocence, our practices of praise and blame, all seem to rest on the assumption that people could have acted differently. Determinism also threatens our sense of self and agency. We feel like authors of our own lives, making genuine choices that shape our future. But if determinism is true, we are more like characters in a book whose every action was written before we were born. The feeling of deliberating between options and freely choosing is just an illusion created by our consciousness. The decision was already made by causal processes we have no control over. We are passengers in our own lives, experiencing the illusion of steering while the vehicle follows tracks laid down by the past. Some philosophers argue for compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism can both be true. They redefine free will as acting according to your own desires and reasoning, even if those desires and reasoning are themselves determined. But this feels like changing the subject. What we want when claiming free will is the ability to have done otherwise, and determinism says this is impossible. The disturbing truth may be that we are mechanisms, biological robots following programming we did not choose, in a universe where nothing could ever have been different. The Myth of Sisyphus. The Myth of Sisyphus is a philosophical essay by Albert Camus that uses the Greek myth to explore the absurdity of human existence and how we should respond. In the myth, Sisyphus was a king punished by the gods to roll a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, forcing him to start over, repeating this meaningless task for eternity. Camus sees Sisyphus as the perfect symbol of human life. We struggle and work toward goals, achieve them temporarily, only to face new struggles, in an endless cycle that ultimately leads nowhere. We are all pushing our own boulders up mountains that offer no lasting satisfaction or final destination. The essay addresses what Camus considers the fundamental question of philosophy, whether life is worth living in an absurd universe. The absurd arises from the confrontation between our human need for meaning, purpose, and rational explanation, and the universe's complete indifference and silence. We desperately want our lives to matter, to have cosmic significance or ultimate purpose. But the universe provides no such meaning. It simply is, operating according to physical laws that care nothing for human values or aspirations. This mismatch between what we need and what the universe provides is the absurd. Camus argues there are three traditional responses to the absurd. First is physical suicide, ending your life because you cannot bear its meaninglessness. Second is philosophical suicide, making a leap of faith into religion or ideology that provides comforting answers but requires abandoning reason and honest confrontation with absurdity. Third, which Camus advocates, is fully acknowledging the absurd while refusing to escape through either form of suicide. We must live with full awareness that life has no inherent meaning, that our struggles lead nowhere, that death will erase everything we accomplish, and yet continue to live and struggle anyway. This is where Sisyphus becomes heroic in Camus' interpretation. Sisyphus is fully aware his task is meaningless. There is no goal to achieve, no progress to make, no hope of escape. Yet he continues. The moment of greatest significance is when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to retrieve his boulder, fully conscious of the futility of what he is about to do again. In that moment of lucid awareness, Sisyphus is greater than his fate. He accepts the absurd, scorns the gods who punished him, and chooses to continue despite everything. Camus concludes with one of philosophy's most famous lines, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The disturbing aspect is that this philosophy offers no escape from meaninglessness, only acceptance of it. Camus does not promise your struggles will be rewarded or suffering has hidden purpose. He says the opposite, that life is endless repetition of meaningless tasks, and the only authentic response is acknowledging this fully while continuing to live with passion and intensity. We are Sisyphus, and our boulder is whatever we dedicate our lives to, knowing it accomplishes nothing permanent. Happiness comes not from finding meaning but from accepting its absence. Animal sacrifice in Theodicy. Animal sacrifice in Theodicy refers to the disturbing theological problem of why innocent animals suffer and die, often in brutal ways, if the universe was created by a good and all-powerful God. Theodicy is the branch of theology that attempts to explain why evil and suffering exist despite God's benevolence and omnipotence. While much theodicy focuses on human suffering, which can be explained through free will or moral development, animal suffering presents a unique challenge. Animals cannot sin, cannot learn moral lessons from pain, cannot be punished justly for wrongdoing, yet they experience terror, agony, and violent death on a massive scale throughout nature. Consider the reality of the natural world. Animals are torn apart alive by predators. They starve slowly during droughts. They die from diseases and parasites that eat them from inside. Baby animals are abandoned or killed by their own parents. Prey animals live in constant fear, and their deaths are often prolonged and agonizing. This has been happening for millions of years before humans existed, countless trillions of animals experiencing suffering and terror. If God designed this system, He deliberately created a world where innocent creatures must suffer and die violently as the basic mechanism of life. Traditional theodicies struggle to address this problem. The free will defense, which argues human suffering results from our misuse of freedom, does not apply to animals who have no moral agency. The soul-making theodicy, which claims suffering builds character and spiritual growth, makes no sense for creatures who lack immortal souls or capacity for moral development. The punishment for sin explanation cannot account for animal suffering because animals are considered innocent. Every major theodicy designed to explain human suffering fails when applied to animals. Some theologians have attempted responses. Some argue animals do not really suffer because they lack self-awareness or their suffering is less morally significant than human suffering. But this seems like arbitrary dismissal of obvious pain and fear. Anyone who has seen an animal in agony knows they suffer. Others suggest animal predation and death are necessary parts of a functioning ecosystem, that God could not have created a world with animal life without including suffering. But this limits God's omnipotence, suggesting He could not design a system without requiring innocent creatures to be torn apart. The problem becomes more disturbing considering that nature operates this way not as unfortunate accident but as fundamental design. Evolution through natural selection requires death, competition, predation, and struggle. For millions of years before humans appeared, this system ground on, producing uncountable suffering in service of no apparent purpose beyond perpetuation of life itself. If this was God's chosen method of creation, He deliberately selected a process that maximizes suffering and death as the engine of diversity and complexity. The animal sacrifice inherent in nature's design reveals either that God is not good, not all-powerful, or does not exist. Terror management theory. Terror management theory is a psychological and philosophical framework proposing that much of human behavior, culture, and civilization is driven by our need to manage the terror of knowing we will die. Unlike other animals living in the present without awareness of their mortality, humans possess the curse of consciousness that allows us to anticipate our own death. This creates profound existential anxiety that would be psychologically unbearable if confronted directly and constantly. Therefore, we construct elaborate psychological defenses, cultural worldviews, and belief systems that help us deny, transcend, or find meaning in our mortality. The disturbing implication is that much of what we consider important, our religions, achievements, and values, may be nothing more than elaborate distractions from the terror of death. The theory emerged from cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who argued that fear of death is the primary motivator of human activity. We cannot bear the knowledge that we are physical beings who will cease to exist, that everything we are and do will eventually be erased by death. This terror is so profound that our psychological systems must protect us from consciously experiencing it most of the time. We do this through two primary mechanisms: cultural worldviews that provide meaning, order, and promise of either literal immortality through afterlife beliefs or symbolic immortality through lasting achievements, and self-esteem from feeling we are valuable members of a meaningful universe. Experimental research supports terror management theory. When people are reminded of their mortality, even subtly, they show increased attachment to their cultural worldviews, increased hostility toward those who threaten those worldviews, increased desire for self-esteem, and increased engagement in behaviors promising symbolic immortality. Death reminders make people more nationalistic, more religious, more materialistic, more likely to support violence against outsiders, and more likely to engage in legacy-building activities. This suggests much of our daily behavior is influenced by unconscious death anxiety, even when not consciously thinking about mortality. The disturbing implications extend to understanding human conflict and cruelty. If people's cultural worldviews function as defenses against death terror, then those holding different worldviews represent a threat. They remind us our meaning system is not universal or absolute but merely one possibility among many. This is why religious and ideological differences create such intense conflict. We are not just defending beliefs, we are defending our psychological shields against existential terror. The other person's different beliefs threaten to undermine the defense system keeping our death anxiety at bay. Terror management theory also suggests human progress and achievement are not primarily about improving life but about denying death. We build monuments that will outlast us, create art that will be remembered, have children who carry our genes and names forward, achieve fame or historical significance, or embrace religious promises of eternal life. These are all strategies for achieving symbolic or literal immortality. Our greatest accomplishments and worst atrocities may both stem from the same desperate need to deny we are mortal animals who will return to dust. Bundle theory of self. Bundle theory of self is the philosophical position that there is no unified, permanent self or soul at the core of personal identity. Instead, what we call the self is simply a collection or bundle of perceptions, thoughts, sensations, and experiences associated together at any given moment. Philosopher David Hume famously argued that when he looked inward to find his self, he could only find particular thoughts, feelings, and sensations, never a unified I that has these experiences. The self is not a thing that possesses experiences but rather just the collection of experiences themselves. This suggests the most fundamental thing we think we know, that we are a continuous, unified person, is an illusion. Hume's introspective argument is powerful. Try to observe your own self directly. What do you find? You might find a thought about work, a sensation of your body, a feeling of curiosity, a memory of breakfast. But do you ever find a thing supposedly having all these experiences? Do you encounter a pure I, separate from thoughts and sensations? Hume argued we do not. We only find particular mental contents, never a substrate that holds them. The self we believe in is just a convenient fiction, a label for a constantly changing bundle of mental states. This challenges personal identity over time. If the self is just a bundle of experiences constantly changing, then in what sense are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Almost none of your selves are the same. Your beliefs, desires, and personality have changed. The experiences making up the bundle called you back then are completely different from those making up you now. The only connection is memory and physical continuity, but these seem like weak foundations. Are you really the same self, or just a different bundle that inherited memories from previous bundles? Bundle theory has implications for moral responsibility and death. If there is no continuous self, then punishing someone for a crime committed years ago means punishing a different bundle of experiences than the one that committed the crime. The person in prison now is not the same person who committed the murder, just a later bundle in the same body with some memories. Similarly, your death might be less tragic if there is no unified self that ceases to exist, just the ending of one bundle of experiences. Buddhism embraces a version of bundle theory through anatta or no self. Buddhism teaches that clinging to the illusion of a permanent self is a primary source of suffering. We suffer because we identify with and try to protect something that does not exist. Liberation comes from realizing there is no self to protect, just a constantly changing stream of experiences. This perspective is both disturbing and potentially liberating, eliminating the foundation of our identity while promising freedom from anxieties that come with defending a self that was never real. The problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is a philosophical puzzle asking how we can know that other people have conscious experiences like our own. You have direct access to your own consciousness, you know what it feels like to see red, to feel pain, to experience sadness. But you can never directly experience another person's consciousness. You can only observe their behavior, their words, their facial expressions, their neural activity. How do you know these behaviors indicate genuine conscious experience rather than being mere mechanical responses? How do you know that other people are not philosophical zombies, beings that behave exactly like conscious humans but have no inner experience whatsoever? The disturbing implication is that you might be the only conscious being in the universe, surrounded by sophisticated automatons that perfectly mimic consciousness without possessing it. The argument rests on the privacy of conscious experience. When you feel pain, you know it directly and indubitably. But when someone else says they are in pain, you are inferring their experience from their behavior. They grimace, they cry out, they withdraw from the painful stimulus. You assume these behaviors indicate an inner experience similar to what you feel when you are in pain. But this is an inference, not direct knowledge. In principle, a robot could be programmed to exhibit all these same behaviors without feeling anything. How do you know the person in front of you is not like that robot? You might argue that other humans have brains similar to yours, and since your brain produces consciousness, their brains probably do too. But this reasoning has problems. First, you have never observed consciousness being produced by a brain, including your own. You experience consciousness, and you have evidence that you have a brain, but you have never witnessed the causal connection between brain activity and conscious experience. Second, even if you accept that your brain causes your consciousness, similarity of physical structure does not guarantee similarity of experience. Two computers with identical hardware might run completely different software, or one might be running software while the other is turned off. Physical similarity does not prove experiential similarity. The philosophical zombie thought experiment makes the problem vivid. Imagine a being physically and behaviorally identical to a human in every way, with a functioning brain, who says all the right things about their feelings and experiences, but has no inner conscious life whatsoever. There is nothing it is like to be this zombie, no subjective experience happening inside. The zombie is sometimes called dark inside. The disturbing question is, how would you know if the person sitting next to you is a zombie rather than genuinely conscious? They would behave identically either way. Your best friend, your family, everyone you have ever known, might be zombies, and you would have no way to detect this. Some philosophers argue the problem is insoluble in principle. You can never have absolute certainty about other minds because consciousness is inherently private and unobservable from the outside. The best you can do is make probabilistic inferences based on behavior and physical similarity. But this means you can never truly know you are not alone. Other philosophers try to dissolve the problem by arguing that the very concept of a philosophical zombie is incoherent, that consciousness and behavior cannot be separated in the way the thought experiment requires. But these responses often feel like changing the subject rather than solving the problem. The problem of other minds connects to deeper questions about solipsism, the view that only your own mind can be known to exist. If you cannot prove other minds exist, perhaps the entire external world is just a construction of your consciousness. Maybe you are the only real thing, and everything else, all other people, all of physical reality, is just content within your own mind. This is philosophically irrefutable but psychologically unbearable. We live our lives assuming other people are conscious like us, that their joys and sufferings are as real as our own. But we cannot prove this assumption, and the possibility that we are fundamentally alone, the only consciousness in a universe of mindless matter mimicking sentience, remains a disturbing possibility we can never eliminate. Causa Sui. Causa Sui is a Latin phrase meaning, cause of itself, referring to the logically impossible notion of something bringing itself into existence. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche used this concept to critique free will and moral responsibility. He argued that to be truly responsible for our actions in the absolute sense morality demands, we would need to be causa sui, to have created ourselves and chosen our own nature before we existed to make such choices. Since this is obviously impossible, Nietzsche concluded that the absolute moral responsibility we attribute to people is incoherent. We are not self-created beings but products of factors beyond our control. The problem becomes clear when you trace responsibility backwards. You are responsible for your actions, but actions flow from your character, values, and desires. Are you responsible for those? Only if you chose them. But choices are determined by your character and reasoning abilities. Are you responsible for having the character and reasoning that led you to make those choices? Only if you chose them. But that choice would require character and reasoning to make it. You fall into infinite regress. To be ultimately responsible, you would need to have created your own nature before you existed, which is logically impossible. Nietzsche called Causa Sui the best self-contradiction conceived so far, comparing it to pulling yourself up into existence by your own hair. Yet our entire system of moral judgment, praise, blame, punishment, and reward rests on the assumption that people are Causa Sui in some sense, that they could have been fundamentally different if they had chosen differently. We treat people as absolutely responsible for actions and deserving eternal punishment or reward based on choices that ultimately trace back to factors they did not control, their genes, upbringing, brain chemistry, and circumstances of birth. This critique extends to the concept of desert, what people deserve. If no one is Causa Sui, if everyone's character and choices are ultimately products of factors beyond their control, then no one truly deserves anything in the absolute sense. The successful person does not deserve success because their talents, work ethic, and opportunities were not self-created. The criminal does not deserve punishment because factors that made them a criminal were not chosen. Luck, both genetic and circumstantial, determines everything, yet we build elaborate systems of justice and reward as if people were self-created beings. Some philosophers argue we can have meaningful responsibility without being Causa Sui, that we need only the ability to act according to our own desires and reasoning even if those were not self-created. But Nietzsche suggested this compatibilist approach dilutes responsibility to meaninglessness. If your desires and reasoning were shaped by forces outside your control, then following them is not genuine freedom but being a sophisticated mechanism. The Causa Sui critique reveals our moral concepts may be built on a foundation that is not just false but logically impossible, yet we cannot organize society without these concepts. Being towards death. Being towards death, or Sein zum Tod, is a central concept in Martin Heidegger's philosophy, referring to the idea that human existence is fundamentally defined by its orientation toward death. Unlike other beings that simply end, humans are aware of their mortality, and this awareness shapes every aspect of our existence. We are not simply beings who will die, we are beings whose very nature is to exist with death as our inevitable future. This constant relation to our own non-being is the fundamental structure of human existence. The disturbing implication is that we are essentially dying from the moment we are born, and authentic existence requires confronting this fact. Heidegger argues most people live in denial about death, what he calls inauthentic existence. We treat death as something happening to other people, as a general biological fact, but not as our own most personal and certain possibility. We distract ourselves with daily concerns, social roles, and the anonymous public world that tells us how to think. We lose ourselves in busyness and conformity, avoiding anxiety from genuinely confronting mortality. This flight from death is also flight from authentic selfhood, because our being towards death is what individuates us, what makes us uniquely who we are. Death, for Heidegger, is the onmost possibility, the one thing absolutely your own that no one else can experience for you. Others can help you with many things, but they cannot die your death. When you die, you face absolute solitude. This makes death the possibility revealing your existence as fundamentally your own, not interchangeable with anyone else. To live authentically means accepting this onmost possibility, living in conscious awareness that you are finite, that time is limited, that every choice forecloses other possibilities, and that ultimately you face your end alone. This awareness does not mean obsessing about death or becoming morbid. It means allowing the finitude of existence to give urgency and meaning to life. When you grasp that time is limited, that death could come at any moment, that you will not have infinite opportunities, you are forced to take choices seriously. Inauthentic existence treats time as infinite, as if there will always be tomorrow to become who you really are. Authentic being towards death recognizes time is running out, that you must choose and act now, that your life is happening in this moment and cannot be postponed. The concept is disturbing because it suggests we are fundamentally incomplete beings, always reaching toward our own impossibility. Death is not something added to life from outside but woven into the fabric of existence itself. We exist as beings constantly running out, whose being is essentially movement toward not being. This makes human existence inherently anxious and unsettled. We cannot rest in stable being but are always projected into a future terminating in our own annihilation. The authentic response is not seeking escape but embracing it, owning your death as the most certain and personal fact about your existence, letting this ownership transform how you live each moment. Ironic process theory. Ironic process theory, also known as the theory of ironic mental processes, is a psychological concept developed by Daniel Wegner explaining why trying to suppress a thought often makes that thought more persistent and intrusive. The classic example is being told not to think about a white bear, which immediately makes thinking about a white bear nearly impossible to avoid. This theory reveals a disturbing aspect of consciousness: we do not have complete control over our own minds. The very act of trying to control thoughts can backfire, making unwanted thoughts more prominent. This has profound implications for understanding mental suffering, addiction, anxiety, and obsessive thinking. The theory proposes that mental control involves two processes working together. First is a conscious, effortful monitoring process that searches for signs of the unwanted thought to ensure you are successfully suppressing it. Second is an automatic, unconscious operating process that tries to find distractions and alternative thoughts. When you are mentally taxed, stressed, or exhausted, the effortful monitoring process continues working but the automatic operating process becomes less effective. This creates an imbalance where your mind keeps checking whether you are thinking about the forbidden thought, and each check ironically brings that thought back into consciousness. The implications are troubling for people suffering from intrusive thoughts. Someone with anxiety who tries not to think about their fears finds those fears becoming more intrusive. Someone overcoming addiction who desperately tries not to think about their substance finds themselves obsessively focused on it. Someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder who tries to suppress disturbing thoughts experiences those thoughts with greater frequency and intensity. The harder they fight their own mind, the more their mind rebels. They become trapped in a paradox where the solution intensifies the problem. This theory explains why insomnia worsens when you desperately try to fall asleep, why dieters who forbid themselves from thinking about food become obsessed with food, and why telling yourself to calm down during panic attacks often makes panic worse. The conscious mind's attempts at control are undermined by unconscious processes meant to help. You become your own worst enemy, locked in internal struggle where trying harder guarantees failure. What makes ironic process theory philosophically disturbing is what it reveals about consciousness and self-control. We believe we are masters of our own minds, that thoughts obey our will, that we can decide what to think about and ignore. But this theory demonstrates consciousness is not a unified system under centralized control. Instead, it is a collection of competing processes that can work against each other. The conscious you wanting to suppress a thought and the unconscious monitoring system checking for that thought are in conflict, and the unconscious process often wins. You are not fully in control of your mental life, and attempts to gain control can worsen things. This suggests acceptance rather than suppression might be the only way to reduce unwanted thoughts, a paradox challenging our intuitions about willpower. Moral desert. Moral desert refers to what people morally deserve based on their actions, character, or circumstances, the idea that good people deserve good outcomes and bad people deserve bad outcomes. This concept is central to our intuitions about justice, reward, and punishment. We feel strongly that virtuous people should be rewarded and vicious people punished. However, when examined philosophically, moral desert becomes deeply problematic. The disturbing question is whether anyone truly deserves anything, and whether the entire concept is built on illusions about free will and responsibility. If no one genuinely deserves their fate, then our systems of justice and social hierarchy may be morally arbitrary. The problem begins with the sources of our character and actions. Why is one person kind and another cruel? The kind person might have been born with temperament inclined toward empathy, raised by loving parents who modeled compassion, and lived in circumstances reinforcing pro-social behavior. The cruel person might have been born with different brain chemistry, abused as a child, and placed in environments rewarding aggression. Neither person chose the factors that shaped who they became. If character is largely determined by genetics, upbringing, and circumstances beyond our control, then how can we deserve praise or blame for having that character? Similarly, consider success and failure in life. The successful person often has talents they did not earn, was born into advantages they did not create, and benefited from luck at crucial moments. The unsuccessful person may have worked just as hard but lacked genetic gifts, family support, or fortunate timing. When we say someone deserves their success, we praise them for factors they did not control. When we say someone deserves their poverty or suffering, we blame them for lacking advantages they never had opportunity to acquire. Moral desert evaporates when we trace outcomes back to their actual causes. This creates a crisis for justice systems built on desert. We punish criminals because we believe they deserve punishment for wrongdoing. But if the criminal's actions were inevitable results of factors beyond their control, brain damage, childhood trauma, genetic predisposition, socioeconomic desperation, then what exactly are they being punished for? We reward high achievers because we believe they deserve recognition. But if their achievements resulted from talents and opportunities they did not earn, then what are we rewarding? The concept of desert seems to require radical free will and self-creation that may not exist. Some philosophers argue we should abandon desert-based thinking entirely and base justice on forward-looking considerations like deterrence, rehabilitation, and social utility rather than backward-looking judgments about what people deserve. Others try to salvage a modified concept of desert not requiring impossible metaphysical assumptions. But both responses acknowledge our intuitive sense of moral desert. The feeling that people get what they deserve or deserve what they get is deeply questionable. The disturbing implication is that the universe is fundamentally unfair, that outcomes are determined by morally arbitrary factors like genetic luck and circumstantial fortune, and that our strong intuitions about justice and deservingness are illusions. Bicameral mind. The bicameral mind is a controversial theory proposed by psychologist Julian Jaynes, arguing that until approximately 3,000 years ago, humans did not possess consciousness in the modern sense. Instead, they operated with a bicameral, or two-chambered mind where the right hemisphere generated auditory hallucinations experienced as voices of gods or ancestors giving commands, and the left hemisphere followed these commands without question. What we recognize as internal dialogue, self-reflection, and conscious decision-making did not exist. Ancient humans heard voices telling them what to do and obeyed without experiencing themselves as autonomous agents with inner mental lives. According to Jaynes, ancient texts like the Iliad support this theory. Heroes do not deliberate or reflect on choices. Instead, gods appear and issue commands they simply follow. There is no internal mental space described, no sense of characters having private thoughts or making conscious decisions. Jaynes argues this was not just literary convention but reflected actual psychological reality. They lacked introspection, had no sense of a unified self observing their own thoughts, and experienced their own mental processes as external voices that must be obeyed. The bicameral mind supposedly broke down due to social and environmental pressures. As societies became more complex, as trade required interaction with strangers who did not share the same gods, as natural disasters created situations where old voices gave contradictory or no guidance, the bicameral system became inadequate. Humans had to develop a new form of cognition we now call consciousness, the ability to introspect, imagine alternative courses of action, and make decisions based on internal deliberation rather than hallucinated commands. This transition was traumatic and left traces in practices like divination and prayer. The theory is deeply disturbing for several reasons. First, it suggests that something as fundamental as consciousness might actually be a recent cultural development. If consciousness is only 3,000 years old, then it is not essential to being human but rather a learned skill or cultural adaptation that could theoretically be lost if conditions changed. Second, it raises unsettling questions about the self. If our ancestors lacked the sense of being a unified I and experienced their own thoughts as external voices, then perhaps the self is more fragile and constructed than we realize. Third, the theory implies that what ancient peoples experienced as gods or spirits might have been their own brain processes externalized due to different neurological organization. The divine voices that founded religions and commanded great deeds were hallucinations generated by the right hemisphere. This would mean much of human history, culture, and religion is built on misunderstanding of internal neural activity. Finally, if consciousness is not hardwired but culturally developed, we must wonder whether we fully possess it even now, whether future humans might develop forms of awareness we cannot imagine, and whether we are still responding to voices in our heads. State of nature as war. The state of nature as war is a concept from political philosopher Thomas Hobbes describing what human life would be like without government, laws, or social order. In his book, Leviathan, Hobbes argued that in a natural state, before establishment of civil society, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without a powerful authority to enforce rules and punish violence, humans would exist in constant war of all against all. This is not because humans are inherently evil but because in a state of nature, everyone has reason to fear everyone else and to strike first before being struck. The disturbing implication is that civilization and morality are thin veneers covering underlying reality of violence. Hobbes argues that in the state of nature, all humans are roughly equal in their abilities to harm each other. Even the weakest person can kill the strongest through cunning or cooperation. This equality creates a problem: no one can feel secure. You might be stronger than your neighbor, but you must sleep sometime, and while you sleep, you are vulnerable. Your neighbor knows this, and you know your neighbor knows this. Therefore, you have reason to attack preemptively, and your neighbor has reason to do the same. Everyone has motive to strike first because waiting puts you at disadvantage. This creates a situation where there is no justice or injustice because there are no agreed-upon rules. Concepts like property, theft, and murder only make sense within a social system with laws and enforcement. In the state of nature, there is only power and survival. You have what you can take and keep. Your life lasts as long as you can defend it. Trust is impossible because there is no mechanism to punish betrayal. Cooperation is unstable because anyone who cooperates makes themselves vulnerable to those who cheat. The rational strategy is mutual suspicion and preemptive violence. Hobbes believed that life in the state of nature would be so unbearable that rational people would agree to give up their natural freedom in exchange for security. They would create a social contract, agreeing to submit to a sovereign power with absolute authority to make and enforce laws. This sovereign, whether monarch or assembly, would hold enough power to make the cost of violence greater than any benefit from it. Peace would be maintained not through goodwill but through fear of punishment. Morality would exist not because people are naturally good but because a powerful state makes immoral behavior unprofitable. The disturbing aspect of this theory is what it implies about human nature and the fragility of civilization. According to Hobbes, we are not naturally cooperative or moral. We follow rules only because we are forced to, because the state has enough power to punish us if we do not. Remove that power, and we quickly revert to the state of nature. Every civil war, every collapse of government, every situation where law enforcement breaks down, seems to confirm this. When social order fails, looting, violence, and chaos often follow rapidly. This suggests our civilized behavior is conditional on coercion, that beneath polite interactions lies barely contained violence, and that we are always only a few missed meals or one failed government away from war of all against all. Panopticism. Panopticism is a concept developed by philosopher Michel Foucault based on the Panopticon, a prison design created by philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century. The Panopticon is a circular prison with a central watchtower from which a guard can observe all prisoners without the prisoners knowing whether they are being watched at any given moment. The cells are arranged in a ring around the tower, backlit so the guard can see into them, but the guard's position is obscured so prisoners cannot tell if anyone is actually there. The genius and horror of this design is that prisoners, unable to know when they are being observed, must assume they are always being watched. They internalize the surveillance and begin to police their own behavior, becoming their own jailers. Foucault extended this architectural concept into a broader theory about how power operates in modern society. Panopticism represents a form of social control where surveillance, or even just the possibility of surveillance, causes people to regulate themselves. You do not need an actual authority figure constantly watching everyone. You only need people to believe they might be watched at any moment. This creates a population that disciplines itself, that conforms to rules not because of immediate threat but because of internalized fear of potential observation and judgment. The watchtower might be empty, but the prisoners still behave as if someone is watching. This concept has become disturbingly relevant in contemporary society with the rise of surveillance technology. Security cameras, internet tracking, social media monitoring, smartphone location data, and facial recognition systems create a real-world panopticon far more comprehensive than Bentham ever imagined. We are constantly aware that our actions might be recorded, our communications might be monitored, our online behavior is certainly being tracked. This awareness shapes how we behave. We self-censor our social media posts knowing employers might see them. We are careful about what we search for online knowing it creates a permanent record. We modify our behavior in public spaces knowing cameras are watching. The truly disturbing aspect of panopticism is how it makes power efficient and invisible. Traditional forms of control required constant active enforcement, guards physically present, authorities actively punishing transgression. Panopticism achieves control through internalization of surveillance. The power becomes part of our own psychology. We monitor ourselves, judge ourselves, and discipline ourselves according to norms we believe the invisible watchers want us to follow. We become complicit in our own control, doing the work of surveillance and discipline that previously required external authorities. Foucault argued that modern institutions like schools, hospitals, factories, and offices all operate on panoptic principles. Students know teachers might be watching, so they behave even when not directly supervised. Workers know their productivity is monitored, so they maintain effort even without a supervisor present. The entire society becomes a system of mutual surveillance where everyone is simultaneously watcher and watched, where power operates not through visible force but through invisible potential observation. The concept reveals how freedom and surveillance are incompatible. When you know or believe you are being watched, you cannot act freely. You perform for the invisible audience, conforming to what you think is expected. Fallenness of Dasein. Fallenness of Dasein is a concept from Martin Heidegger's existential philosophy describing the tendency of human existence to lose itself in the everyday world and avoid confronting authentic possibilities. Dasein is Heidegger's term for human being, literally meaning being there, emphasizing we are beings who exist in a world. Fallenness does not carry moral judgment but describes a structural feature of human existence. We naturally fall into patterns of conformity, distraction, and inauthenticity, losing ourselves in the they-self rather than owning our existence as individuals. This suggests the default mode of human life is self-evasion, fleeing from ourselves into comfortable anonymity of doing what everyone does. Fallen Dasein is characterized by several features. First is idle talk, the tendency to speak and think in conventional ways using inherited concepts without genuinely understanding them. We repeat what they say, adopt opinions because everyone holds them, and mistake familiarity with genuine comprehension. Second is curiosity, restless seeking of novelty and distraction that never dwells with anything long enough to understand it deeply. We constantly consume information and experiences but remain on the surface. Third is ambiguity, a state where everything seems equally meaningful or meaningless, where genuine possibilities cannot be distinguished from empty options. Fallen Dasein exists in the mode of the they, the anonymous public that determines what is done and not done. We dress as they dress, think as they think, value what they value, pursue the goals they pursue. We become interchangeable with others, losing individuality in conformity. This is not simply social pressure from outside but a temptation built into existence itself. It is easier and more comfortable to be like everyone else, to lose ourselves in routine and convention, than to face anxiety of being a unique individual who must create their own meaning and choose their own path. What makes fallenness disturbing is that it is not something we can simply decide to overcome once and for all. It is a constant structural feature of existence. Even when we achieve moments of authenticity, we inevitably fall back into comfort of conformity and distraction. The everyday world is seductive, promising relief from anxiety of existence, from burden of freedom and confrontation with mortality. We flee from ourselves into busyness, entertainment, social roles, and conventional understanding because facing authentic possibilities requires courage we can only sustain briefly. Heidegger emphasizes fallenness is not a moral failure but an existential structure. We are thrown into a world with others, and socialization is necessary for development and survival. The problem is when we remain entirely absorbed in this public world without ever confronting our own unique existence. We live as they live without asking whether this is how we, as individuals, want to live. We pursue goals because they are goals everyone pursues without asking if they genuinely matter to us. We drift through life carried along by social currents, never taking hold of our existence as our own. The Undead God. The Undead God is a concept emerging from Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead, and explores how God, despite being culturally and intellectually dead, continues to haunt Western civilization like a corpse that will not stay buried. Nietzsche announced the death of God in the late 19th century, recognizing that advances in science, philosophy, and critical thinking had undermined foundations of religious belief. However, he worried people had not grasped full implications of this death. They continued to live by Christian values, structure their morality on Christian assumptions, and seek meaning through Christian frameworks, even while no longer truly believing in the Christian God. God became undead, no longer genuinely alive as living faith but not fully dead either, continuing to influence culture as a zombie. The problem with the undead God is that it creates cultural and psychological confusion. People no longer believe in heaven, hell, or divine judgment in the literal sense their ancestors did. They do not expect prayers answered or miracles to occur. Science has explained phenomena once attributed to divine intervention. Yet these same people continue to hold moral positions that only make sense if God exists. They believe in universal human rights as if humans were created in God's image. They believe in sanctity of human life as if divinely ordained. They seek ultimate meaning and purpose as if there were a cosmic plan. They feel guilt as if someone were watching and judging them. This creates what Nietzsche called nihilism, not active embrace of meaninglessness but a passive state where old values have lost foundation but new values have not yet been created. People sense something is wrong, that life feels empty or purposeless, but cannot identify the source. They are like children told there is no Santa Claus but continue to behave as if you were watching and keeping track of whether they are naughty or nice. The belief structure has been intellectually abandoned, but psychological and emotional patterns it created remain. The undead God manifests in secular substitutes for religion. People stop going to church but seek spiritual experiences through meditation apps, self-help books, and wellness culture. They stop believing in salvation but obsessively pursue self-improvement as if perfecting themselves were sacred duty. They stop believing in divine judgment but subject themselves to judgment of social media, where sins are catalogued and punished by anonymous mobs. They stop believing in religious meaning but desperately seek meaning through political ideologies, treating political movements with fervor of religious crusades. These are symptoms of a culture that has killed God but cannot escape the God-shaped hole in its consciousness. What makes the undead God disturbing is that it suggests we cannot simply move on from religion as if it were a phase we have outgrown. The psychological structures, moral intuitions, and need for ultimate meaning were shaped by thousands of years of religious thinking. You cannot simply remove God and expect everything else to remain intact or reorganize into something coherent. Instead, you get a zombie, a corpse that continues to move and influence the living even though it is dead. Vanity of Existence. Vanity of existence is a philosophical concept, particularly emphasized by Arthur Schopenhauer, referring to the fundamental emptiness and futility of life. The term vanity here means emptiness, worthlessness, or futility rather than excessive pride. The concept suggests that all human striving, all our goals and achievements, all our pleasures and pains, ultimately amount to nothing. Life is a meaningless cycle of desire, temporary satisfaction, and renewed desire, leading nowhere and signifying nothing. We are like hamsters on a wheel, expending enormous energy to run faster while remaining in exactly the same place, achieving nothing of lasting value or significance. Schopenhauer argued that life oscillates between suffering and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer from need, frustration, and longing. When we achieve what we desire, we experience a brief moment of satisfaction that quickly gives way to either boredom or new desires. Happiness is not a positive state but merely the temporary absence of suffering. We mistake the relief from pain for genuine pleasure, but once pain is gone, we discover there is nothing positive underneath, only emptiness. This creates a trap where we are driven by will and desire to pursue goals that, once achieved, reveal themselves to be hollow. Consider any human ambition. Someone works their entire life to achieve wealth, success, or fame. They finally achieve their goal and discover it does not bring the fulfillment they imagined. The achievement feels empty. They realize they sacrificed years of their life for something that ultimately does not matter. Or consider romantic love, perhaps the most powerful human drive. People obsess over finding the perfect partner, believing this will complete them and bring lasting happiness. They fall in love, and the initial intensity fades into routine or disappointment. The object of desire, once obtained, loses its power to satisfy. This pattern repeats across every domain of human life. The vanity of existence becomes especially apparent when we consider death. Everything we achieve, every relationship we build, every experience we have, will be erased by death. Not just our own death, but eventually the heat death of the universe that will erase all trace of humanity. From the perspective of eternity, or even just a few generations hence, our lives and accomplishments are utterly insignificant. We spend decades building careers, accumulating possessions, pursuing goals, as if these things mattered, when they are just ways of distracting ourselves from the void. What makes this concept particularly disturbing is that recognizing the vanity of existence does not free us from it. Even when we see through the illusion, even when we recognize that our desires lead nowhere and our achievements mean nothing, we cannot stop desiring and striving. The will to live, the biological and psychological drives that push us forward, continue to operate regardless of our intellectual understanding. We are condemned to pursue what we know to be empty, to care about what we know to be meaningless. Apophatic Theology. Apophatic theology, also known as negative theology, is a religious and philosophical approach claiming we can only speak about God by describing what God is not, rather than what God is. According to this view, God is so fundamentally different from anything we can experience or conceive that any positive statement about God's nature is inherently false or inadequate. We cannot say God is good, powerful, or loving in any way we understand those terms, because God transcends all human categories and concepts. The only truthful way to approach the divine is through negation, stripping away assumptions and descriptions until we are left with mystery and silence. This is disturbing because it suggests the central object of religious devotion is utterly unknowable and that all our theologies and beliefs are based on fundamental misunderstandings. The logic begins with the observation that God, if God exists, must be infinite and transcendent. Anything infinite cannot be captured by finite human language or minds. When we say God is good, we are projecting our limited human understanding of goodness onto something that infinitely exceeds that understanding. We are making God in our image rather than understanding God as God actually is. Every description we offer, every attribute we assign, limits and distorts divine reality. Therefore, mystics and apophatic theologians argue, the path to God requires unlearning, a systematic negation of everything we think we know. This approach leads to paradoxical statements. God is not being, but not non-being either. God is not one, but not many. God is not present, but not absent. God is not knowable, but not unknowable in the ordinary sense. Each negation points towards something beyond the categories we use to organize reality. Medieval Christian mystic Pseudo-Dionysius wrote that we must ascend beyond all knowledge into unknowing, beyond all language into silence, beyond all light into divine darkness. The closer we come to God, the less we can say, until finally we fall silent before incomprehensible mystery. What makes apophatic theology disturbing is its radical skepticism about religious knowledge. Most religious believers assume they know something true about God, that scriptures reveal God's nature, that doctrines capture divine truth. Apophatic theology says this is all illusion. The God you think you worship, the God you pray to, the God described in holy books, is not God but an idol, a human projection that has nothing to do with actual divine reality. Your entire religious life might be based on profound misunderstanding. You might be worshipping an idea rather than encountering the real but incomprehensible God. This creates a crisis of meaning for religious practice. If we cannot know anything true about God, then how do we pray? What do rituals mean? How do we distinguish true religion from false religion if all descriptions are equally inadequate? Apophatic theology seems to undermine the very possibility of religion by insisting that the object of religion is unknowable. Yet it claims this unknowing is itself a form of knowledge, a recognition of God's absolute transcendence. We are left where the deepest religious truth is that we cannot know religious truth, where the closest approach to God is admitting God is fundamentally beyond approach. The Last Man. The last man is a concept introduced by Friedrich Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, describing a type of human being that represents the endpoint of a certain trajectory of civilization. The last man is someone who has abandoned all higher aspirations, all struggle, all risk, and all greatness in favor of comfort, security, and petty pleasures. This is not humanity's extinction but rather a form of existence so diminished that it represents spiritual death while still biologically alive. Nietzsche presents the last man as the most contemptible type of human, yet disturbingly, the last man is perfectly content with this diminished existence and sees it as progress. The last man has eliminated suffering from life, but in doing so has also eliminated everything that makes life meaningful. There is no more struggle, no striving for excellence, no risk or danger. Everyone is equal because no one attempts to be exceptional. Life is comfortable, safe, and boring. The last man works a little, rests a little, pursues small pleasures, and avoids anything difficult or challenging. When confronted with the idea of greatness or higher meaning, the last man blinks and asks, "What is love? What is creation? What is longing?" The last man has forgotten that such things exist or matter. Nietzsche presents the last man as the opposite of the Übermensch, the individual who creates their own values and embraces life's challenges. While the Overman represents humanity's potential for self-overcoming and greatness, the last man represents potential for self-diminishment and mediocrity. The disturbing aspect is that the last man has achieved what many modern societies claim to want: happiness, equality, peace, and comfort. Yet Nietzsche sees this achievement as catastrophe, as the death of what makes us distinctly human. The last man's world is one of universal mediocrity. No one is significantly better or worse than anyone else. Ambition is seen as unseemly. Excellence is viewed with suspicion. Anyone who wants to climb mountains or create something great is told, "We have invented happiness." The last man cannot understand why anyone would want to struggle or suffer for something higher. From the last man's perspective, such desires are irrational. Why risk comfort and security for something as abstract as meaning or greatness? What makes this concept particularly disturbing is that Nietzsche's description seems to anticipate aspects of modern consumer society. We live in cultures that prioritize safety, comfort, and entertainment. We avoid risk and hardship. We seek to eliminate all forms of suffering, even suffering from striving for difficult goals. We pursue happiness through consumption and distraction. We are suspicious of anyone claiming their way of life is superior. We have, in many ways, created the world the last man desires. Nietzsche presents this as a warning. Without struggle, challenge, and willingness to risk comfort for higher purposes, humanity becomes contemptible. We become beings who exist but do not truly live, who are safe but not free, who are comfortable but not fulfilled. The Master-Slave Dialectic. The Master-Slave Dialectic is a concept from George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, describing a fundamental struggle for recognition between consciousnesses and the paradoxical relationship that emerges. According to Hegel, self-consciousness arises only through recognition by another self-consciousness. I become aware of myself as a self only when another consciousness recognizes me as such. This creates a problem. Two self-consciousnesses meet, and each desires recognition from the other, but each also wants to be recognized as independent and autonomous. This leads to a life-and-death struggle where each tries to prove autonomy by risking life, showing they are not merely biological beings but free consciousnesses. In this struggle, one party blinks first. Faced with possibility of death, one consciousness chooses biological survival over risk of death. This person becomes the slave. The other, willing to risk death, becomes the master. The master has won recognition, their autonomy and freedom are acknowledged by the slave who submits and serves. The slave is reduced to a thing, an instrument of the master's will, seemingly denied full self-consciousness and freedom. The master lives freely, enjoying fruits of the slave's labor without working. The slave works, transforming nature to satisfy the master's desires. However, Hegel argues this relationship contains a paradoxical reversal. The master's recognition is worthless because it comes from someone they do not recognize as an equal. You cannot achieve genuine self-consciousness through recognition from someone you treat as less than human. The master becomes dependent on the slave for needs, losing the independence they fought for. They become passive consumers, disconnected from reality, while the slave remains engaged with the world through work. Meanwhile, the slave, through labor, transforms nature and thereby transforms themselves. Through work, the slave develops skills, discipline, and genuine autonomy. The slave recognizes their own power and freedom through creative transformation of the world. The dialectic suggests that mastery leads to dependence and stagnation, while slavery leads to independence and development. The master, seemingly free, becomes trapped in dependency. The slave, seemingly trapped, develops capacities for genuine freedom. This relationship contains seeds of its own dissolution. Eventually, the slave recognizes their own self-sufficiency and the master recognizes their dependence. The relationship must be overcome and superseded by mutual recognition between equals. This concept has been enormously influential in understanding social and historical conflicts. Karl Marx used it to analyze class struggle. Frantz Fanon applied it to colonialism. The dialectic reveals how relationships of domination are inherently unstable and self-defeating, containing contradictions that drive historical change. What makes the master-slave dialectic disturbing is what it suggests about power and recognition. Those who seem to have all power are actually trapped in relationships of dependency. Those who seem powerless are actually developing capacities that will ultimately free them. But this process requires going through painful experience of domination. There is no shortcut to mutual recognition. You must pass through asymmetrical relationship where some recognize others without being recognized in return. History is driven forward by these contradictions and conflicts. The Gnostic Demiurge. The Gnostic Demiurge is a concept from ancient Gnostic religious traditions presenting one of the most disturbing cosmologies ever conceived. According to Gnostic mythology, the material world was not created by the true God, the ultimate transcendent source of all being, but by a lesser, ignorant, and possibly malevolent deity called the Demiurge. This false god believes itself to be the supreme being and demands worship, but it is actually ignorant of the true divine reality existing beyond it. The material world it created is a prison designed to trap divine sparks of consciousness in matter, keeping souls ignorant of their true spiritual nature. What we experience as reality is therefore not a divine creation but a cosmic mistake or deliberate trap. The Gnostic myth typically describes the Demiurge as emerging from a flaw or error in the divine realm. Sophia, a divine being, acts without her consort and produces a malformed offspring, the Demiurge, sometimes identified with the Old Testament God Yahweh. This being, cut off from the highest divine reality, creates the material cosmos. It fashions the physical world and human bodies as prisons for souls, fragments of divine light that have fallen from higher realms. The Demiurge and its subordinate powers, called archons, rule over this realm, keeping humanity ignorant and trapped in cycles of reincarnation and suffering. Humans, according to Gnosticism, contain a divine spark imprisoned in flesh. Most people are completely ignorant of this, living entire lives without knowing they are spiritual beings trapped in a false reality created by a false god. The Demiurge wants to keep humans ignorant because knowledge threatens its power. True religion, from the Gnostic perspective, is about gnosis, direct knowledge of your divine nature and the true God beyond the Demiurge. Salvation comes not through faith or good works but through awakening to the truth of your imprisonment and the falseness of the Creator God. This cosmology inverts conventional religious understanding. The creator of the material world is not worthy of worship but is actually the enemy of humanity. The physical world is not good or divinely ordained but is a prison or mistake. The serpent in Eden, who offers knowledge, might be the hero trying to liberate humanity from the Demiurge's deception. Mainstream religion that worships the Creator God is actually serving the false god, reinforcing the prison, keeping souls ignorant and trapped. What makes the Gnostic Demiurge concept deeply disturbing is its cosmic pessimism and paranoia. It suggests we are living in a fundamentally hostile reality created by an ignorant or malevolent intelligence. The world's suffering is not a mystery to be explained but the natural consequence of being created by a flawed God. Every institution of power, every religious authority, every structure of the material world, might be part of the Demiurge's system of control. Trust nothing, question everything, because reality itself is a deception. The concept also raises uncomfortable questions that remain philosophically relevant. If an all-powerful, all-good God created the world, why is there so much suffering? Why does nature operate through predation and violence? Why are we mortal beings trapped in decaying bodies? The Gnostic answer, that the world was created by an imperfect or malevolent being rather than a perfect God, actually resolves certain theological problems while creating new existential horror. We are not living in a divinely ordered cosmos but in a cosmic prison run by a false God who demands our worship and obedience. Transvaluation of Values. Transvaluation of values is a concept central to Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, referring to a radical re-evaluation and reversal of all traditional moral values. Nietzsche argued that values Western civilization has held sacred for millennia, particularly Christian values like humility, selflessness, pity, and equality, are actually harmful to human flourishing. These values emerged not from strength but from weakness, created by those who lacked power as a way to constrain those who possessed it. True morality should affirm life, strength, creativity, and the will to power rather than glorifying weakness and self-denial. Transvaluation means overturning this slave morality and creating new values based on life affirmation. Nietzsche distinguished between master morality and slave morality. Master morality, the original morality of the strong and noble, defines good as everything enhancing power, vitality, and excellence. Bad is simply what is weak or contemptible. This aristocratic morality celebrates hierarchy, achievement, and self-assertion. Slave morality, by contrast, emerged from resentment of the weak against the strong. Unable to compete with the powerful, the weak declared that qualities of the strong, pride, ambition, self-assertion, are evil. They elevated their own weaknesses, humility, meekness, compassion, into virtues. They created a moral system where being powerless is good and being powerful is evil. Christianity, according to Nietzsche, is the ultimate expression of slave morality. It took virtues of the weak and sick and made them the highest values. It taught that the meek shall inherit the earth, that the last shall be first, that suffering is redemptive, that self-denial is holy. This represents profound sickness in civilization, a turning against life itself. Christianity made humanity feel guilty for its most natural and healthy impulses, for desiring power, pleasure, and achievement. It created a culture of self-loathing where people despised their own vitality and strength. Transvaluation means recognizing this genealogy of morals and creating new values that affirm rather than deny life. It means rejecting the idea that suffering is redemptive or weakness is virtuous. It means embracing hierarchy, excellence, and pursuit of power not as evils to overcome but as expressions of healthy humanity. It means moving beyond good and evil as traditionally understood toward a morality based on enhancing life rather than restraining it. This does not mean simple cruelty but rather creative affirmation of existence in all its struggle. What makes transvaluation disturbing is its radical challenge to deeply held moral convictions. Nietzsche is not just disagreeing about particular ethical rules but attacking foundations of Western morality itself. He suggests that what we have been taught to regard as highest virtues, compassion, equality, selflessness, are actually expressions of weakness and resentment. That what we have been taught to condemn as vices, pride, ambition, will to dominate, are actually healthy expressions of vitality. This inversion is profoundly disorienting because it suggests our moral compasses have been pointing in exactly the wrong direction. The concept also raises the question of what happens after transvaluation. If we overturn traditional values, what replaces them? Without guidance of traditional morality, how do we know what is truly life-affirming? Will to power. Will to power is Friedrich Nietzsche's fundamental concept describing the primary driving force of all life. According to Nietzsche, every living thing seeks not survival or pleasure but rather to expand its power and influence. The will to power is the basic instinct underlying all behavior, from simplest organisms seeking to grow and dominate their environment to humans creating art, philosophy, and civilizations. This is not merely will to dominate others but rather a drive to overcome resistance, to expand capacities, to impose interpretation on the world. Everything that lives seeks to discharge its strength, to become more than it currently is. Nietzsche argued that other philosophers misunderstood human motivation. Schopenhauer claimed we are driven by will to live, but Nietzsche noted that organisms often risk or sacrifice life for something beyond mere survival. Utilitarians claimed we seek pleasure and avoid pain, but Nietzsche observed humans often choose difficult struggles over easy pleasures, seeking challenges that bring suffering because overcoming them enhances power. The will to power better explains why artists suffer for creations, why philosophers endure isolation for truth, why individuals sacrifice comfort for achievement. The will to power operates at all levels. In nature, it appears as growth, reproduction, and competition. In psychology, it manifests as drive for achievement, recognition, and self-overcoming. In society, it creates hierarchies, institutions, and conflicts between competing wills. Even morality is an expression of will to power. Different moral systems represent different strategies for enhancing or constraining power. Slave morality is will to power of the weak, using moral condemnation as weapon against those who possess actual power. Master morality is will to power of the strong, directly expressing vitality. Nietzsche believed acknowledging will to power allows us to move beyond illusions. Most philosophical and religious systems deny or disguise will to power, pretending humans seek truth, virtue, or salvation when these are just means of exercising will. Religion gives priests power over believers. Philosophy gives intellectuals status. Even self-sacrifice is often subtle power-seeking, gaining moral superiority or future reward. Honesty about will to power means recognizing these hidden motivations and consciously directing power toward genuine creativity and self-overcoming. What makes will to power disturbing is its apparent amorality and its implication that all values and truths are ultimately power struggles. If everything reduces to will to power, then concepts like justice, truth, and goodness are just masks worn by various wills seeking dominance. Your beliefs about right and wrong might just be strategies your will to power adopted to increase influence. The philosopher claiming to seek truth is really seeking power from being recognized as wise. The saint claiming to serve God is really seeking power of moral superiority. The concept also suggests moralities of equality and compassion are forms of weakness attempting to constrain strength. If life is fundamentally will to power, then systems suppressing power-seeking work against life itself. This leads to disturbing implications about hierarchy and competition. The will to power remains a troubling vision of existence as fundamentally about struggle and expansion of power rather than cooperation or harmony. Divine hiddenness. Divine hiddenness is a philosophical and theological problem referring to the apparent absence or concealment of God in a world where, if God exists and desires relationship with humanity, we would expect clearer evidence. The problem is simple. If God is all-loving and wants humans to believe and relate to him, and if God is all-powerful and capable of revealing himself clearly, then why is God's existence not obvious to everyone? Why do sincere, thoughtful, morally decent people fail to believe? Why does God hide when clear revelation would save souls and prevent suffering from doubt? The problem becomes acute when many religious traditions claim believing in God is necessary for salvation. If failing to believe results in eternal damnation or separation from God, then divine hiddenness seems incompatible with God's love and justice. A loving parent does not hide from children and then punish them for not finding the parent. A just judge does not conceal the law and then condemn people for breaking it. Yet this appears exactly what divine hiddenness implies, that God remains hidden while making belief a condition for reward or punishment. Various theodicies attempt to explain divine hiddenness. Some argue God's hiddenness preserves human freedom, that if God's existence were obvious, we would have no choice but to believe and obey. Others suggest seeking God in uncertainty builds character and faith in ways certain knowledge could not. Still others claim God is not actually hidden but that humans are blinded by sin or willful rejection. These explanations seem inadequate. Freedom is not obviously enhanced by making truth difficult to discern. Character building through doubt seems unnecessarily cruel when eternal stakes are involved. Blaming non-belief on sin seems unjust when many non-believers are sincere truth seekers. The hiddenness becomes more troubling when we consider unevenness of revelation. Throughout history, God has supposedly revealed himself clearly to some through miracles and visions while remaining hidden from others. Why does God appear to Paul, providing certain knowledge, while leaving others to struggle with doubt their entire lives? The unequal distribution of evidence seems arbitrary and unjust. Some receive overwhelming proof while others receive nothing, yet all are supposedly judged by the same standard. Divine hiddenness also creates practical problems. Different religions claim different revelations from God, each insisting their understanding is correct. If God were less hidden and more clear, presumably these conflicts could be resolved. Instead, divine hiddenness allows for religious pluralism and conflict, with millions convinced they know God's will while contradicting each other. This suggests either that God does not care about doctrinal clarity or that no actual divine communication is occurring. What makes divine hiddenness disturbing is that it provides evidence against the existence of a loving, all-powerful God while being difficult to refute. The absence of clear divine presence is exactly what we would expect if God does not exist, yet believers can always respond that God has mysterious reasons for remaining hidden. Those who genuinely search but find no convincing evidence must either believe without adequate reason or risk divine punishment for honest doubt. Inherent meaninglessness. Inherent meaninglessness is the philosophical position that the universe and human existence contain no built-in purpose, value, or significance. Meaning is not discovered in reality but rather projected onto it by conscious beings who need meaning to function psychologically. The cosmos itself is indifferent, operating according to physical laws that care nothing for human concerns. Stars explode, galaxies collide, species go extinct, and none of it means anything beyond the physical facts of what occurred. There is no cosmic narrative, no ultimate purpose, no grand design. We are biological accidents, and when we die, the universe will continue exactly as it would have if we had never existed. This position differs from nihilism importantly. Nihilism often suggests the absence of inherent meaning leads to despair or that nothing matters. Inherent meaninglessness simply observes that meaning is not a feature of reality but rather something humans construct. We create meaning through our projects, relationships, values, and narratives. This constructed meaning is real and important to us, but not inherent in the universe. It exists in our minds and cultures, not in the fabric of reality. When we say love is meaningful or justice matters, we describe human values, not cosmic truths. The evidence comes from observing nature without anthropomorphic projection. A supernova does not happen for a reason or serve a purpose. It is simply the inevitable result of physical processes according to natural laws. Evolution does not progress toward any goal, just differential reproduction shaped by environmental pressures. The dinosaurs did not go extinct to make room for mammals. An asteroid impact created conditions they could not survive. There is no moral because it is not a story, just events following causation. Human history reveals the same pattern. Civilizations rise and fall not according to justice or divine plan but according to geography, climate, technology, disease, and chance. Empires that lasted centuries are now ruins. The people who built them thought their achievements would last forever, that their gods favored them, that their civilization had meaning. Now tourists photograph rubble. In another 1,000 years, our civilization will likely be equally forgotten, our monuments equally meaningless. Recognizing inherent meaninglessness can be liberating or terrifying. For some, it removes the pressure of discovering or fulfilling a cosmic purpose. You are free to create your own meaning, to value what you choose, without worrying whether you serve the universe's plan. For others, it creates existential anxiety. If nothing ultimately matters, why bother with anything? If all achievements will be forgotten and the universe does not care, what is the point? Religious traditions typically reject inherent meaninglessness, insisting that God or ultimate reality provides objective meaning and purpose. Materialist philosophies typically accept it, arguing that acknowledging reality as it is rather than as we wish it were is necessary for intellectual honesty. The debate cannot be resolved empirically because meaning is not something you can measure or detect. What makes inherent meaninglessness disturbing is that it suggests our intuitions are products of evolution that helped ancestors survive, not accurate perceptions of reality. We feel our lives mean something because brains that generated such feelings motivated their owners to survive and reproduce. The feeling of meaningfulness is an adaptation, not insight into cosmic truth. We are meaning-generating machines living in a meaningless universe, forever projecting significance onto indifferent reality. No self-doctrine. The no-self doctrine, known in Buddhism as anatta, presents one of the most unsettling challenges to how we understand ourselves. This ancient philosophical concept suggests that what we call the self, the I, that we believe exists at our core, is actually an illusion. There is no permanent, unchanging essence that makes you who you are. Instead, you are simply a collection of constantly changing physical and mental components that come together temporarily. Think about it this way. When you say, I, what are you actually referring to? Is it your body? But your body is constantly changing. The cells that made up your body 7 years ago have almost all been replaced. Is it your thoughts? But your thoughts come and go, appearing and disappearing like clouds in the sky. Is it your memories? But memories fade, change, and can even be false. Is it your personality? But that too shifts over time. The person you were as a child is vastly different from who you are now. The no-self doctrine argues that when we search for this thing we find nothing solid or permanent. We discover only a flowing river of experiences, sensations, thoughts, and feelings. There is no captain steering the ship, no little person inside your head making decisions. There is just the ship itself, moving through water. This challenges our deepest intuitions about existence. We feel like there is someone in here, experiencing life. But according to this doctrine, that feeling is just another passing phenomenon, no more substantial than any other experience. What makes this truly disturbing is the implications. If there is no self, then who is living your life? Who makes your choices? Who suffers or feels joy? The doctrine suggests that suffering occurs, but there is no permanent you that suffers. Thoughts arise, but there is no thinker. Actions happen, but there is no actor. Everything flows like a river, with no solid ground beneath it. This can feel liberating to some, who see it as freedom from the burden of a fixed identity. But to others, it feels like standing at the edge of an abyss. It threatens to dissolve everything we think we know about ourselves. The doctrine also raises practical concerns. If there is no self, how can we be held responsible for our actions? How can we plan for the future or learn from the past if there is no continuous self connecting these moments? How do we maintain relationships if the person we loved yesterday is not the same person today? These questions make the no-self doctrine not just a theoretical puzzle but a deeply disturbing challenge to how we live our daily lives. It suggests that the foundation of our entire existence, the belief in a coherent, continuing self, might be nothing more than a convincing story we tell ourselves. Solipsism. Solipsism is perhaps the loneliest and most isolating philosophical position imaginable. It is the idea that you can only be certain of one thing: your own mind exists. Everything else, every other person, every object, the entire external world, might be nothing more than a creation of your consciousness. You could be the only thing that truly exists, and everything around you might be an elaborate dream, simulation, or projection of your own mind. No one else might be real. No one else might be conscious. You might be utterly, completely alone in existence. The reasoning behind solipsism starts from a seemingly innocent observation. All of your experiences happen inside your consciousness. You never directly experience the external world. You only experience your perceptions, your sensations, your thoughts about the world. When you see a tree, you do not experience the tree itself. You experience the image of a tree in your mind. When you talk to a friend, you do not directly access their thoughts or feelings. You only perceive their words and actions and make inferences about what might be happening inside them. But you can never know for certain that there is anyone actually home inside them. This leads to a terrifying possibility. How do you know that other people are conscious? How do you know they are not simply sophisticated automatons, biological robots that behave as if they are conscious but actually have no inner life? You cannot step inside someone else's mind to verify their consciousness. You can only observe their behavior and assume they are like you. But what if they are not? What if you are the only conscious being, and everyone else is just part of the scenery in your private mental universe? The solipsist cannot escape this prison of their own consciousness. Even scientific evidence about the external world comes to them through their senses, which are part of their consciousness. Even logical arguments exist as thoughts in their mind. There is no way to step outside of consciousness to verify that anything exists independently of it. This creates a perfect philosophical trap. You are locked inside your own mind, unable to prove that anything beyond it is real. What makes solipsism particularly disturbing is not just the intellectual puzzle it presents but the emotional devastation it implies. If solipsism is true, then every relationship you have ever had is with a figment of your imagination. Every person you have loved is just a character in your mental drama. Every meaningful conversation is just you talking to yourself. All human connection is an illusion. You are, and have always been, completely alone. The entire human story, all of history, all art, all love, all suffering, is just happening inside your isolated consciousness. Most philosophers reject solipsism not because they can disprove it, but because it is unbearable to accept and practically impossible to live by. Even if solipsism were true, we must act as if other people exist and matter, because the alternative is a descent into madness. Yet the fact that we cannot definitively refute solipsism means that, in our darkest moments, we might wonder if we truly are alone in a universe of our own making, forever separated from genuine connection with anyone else. Ego death. Ego death refers to the complete loss of subjective self-identity, a temporary dissolution of the boundary between self and other where the sense of being a separate individual consciousness disappears. This experience can occur through meditation, psychedelic substances, extreme stress, or certain spiritual practices. During ego death, the person ceases to experience themselves as a distinct I, observing the world from a particular vantage point. Instead, there is just experience without an experiencer, consciousness without a sense of someone being conscious. The usual narrative of me, with its history, personality, preferences, and concerns simply vanishes, leaving only raw awareness. The term ego death comes from psychology and psychedelic research but connects to ancient mystical traditions describing union with the divine, dissolution of self, or enlightenment. What makes this experience particularly disturbing and fascinating is that it reveals the self we take for granted as the most obvious feature of existence might actually be a construct, a story the brain tells rather than a fundamental fact. The ego, our sense of being a continuous unified person, is apparently something that can be turned off, suggesting it was never as real or solid as it seemed. People who experience ego death report both terror and bliss, often simultaneously or in rapid succession. The terror comes from the dissolution of everything you identify with. Your entire sense of who you are, your memories, your personality, your body, your life story, all of it disappears. This feels like dying because in a sense you are dying, the psychological entity you identified as yourself is ceasing to exist. There is often a desperate struggle to hold on to identity as it slips away, a profound fear of annihilation. Yet those who surrender to ego death often report that once the self dissolves completely, there is unexpected peace or even euphoria. Without the ego, there is no fear because there is no one to be afraid. Without the sense of a separate self, there is no loneliness because there is no separation. Some describe feeling united with everything, experiencing reality directly without the filter of self-concept. Others report a sense of infinite space, pure consciousness, or absolute presence. The experience is often described as more real than ordinary reality, though it cannot be adequately captured in language. The philosophical implications are profound and disturbing. If the self can completely disappear while consciousness continues, then what are we really? The ego we spend our entire lives defending, developing, and defining turns out to be optional, a mode of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. This raises questions about personal identity and continuity. Are you really the same person who existed before ego death? If the self is just a construct that can dissolve and reform, what persists across this dissolution? Is there a deeper identity beneath the ego, or is there just consciousness taking on various forms including the form of seeming to be a particular person? Ego death also challenges assumptions about mental health and well-being. Western psychology typically treats the development and maintenance of a strong, coherent ego as essential for health. Ego dissolution is often categorized as pathological, as psychotic break from reality. Yet mystical traditions and many who have experienced ego death claim it provides profound insight and liberation. Perhaps the ordinary ego-based consciousness is itself a kind of illusion or limitation that we mistake for the totality of what we are. What makes ego death truly disturbing is the implication that you, as you understand yourself, might not actually exist in the way you think you do. The person reading these words, with all your memories, characteristics, and sense of being a particular individual, might be a temporary pattern that consciousness has taken, no more permanent or fundamental than a wave is to the ocean. Ego death suggests that personal identity is something consciousness does rather than something consciousness has, and that this doing can be undone.